had seen a Guild Navigator in centuries, not the Emperor, not the Landsraad, not the Bene Gesserit, whose intelligence networks penetrated every other institution in the Imperium with a thoroughness that millennia of practice had refined. The Navigators existed inside their tanks, sealed chambers filled with concentrated spice gas at levels that would have killed an unaugmented human in minutes, and they had existed inside those tanks for so long that the question of what they looked like had passed from curiosity to rumour to mythology. Some said they were still human. Some said they had become something else entirely. The truth, when it was eventually revealed, was stranger than either position suggested and more disturbing than most of the people who had been speculating were prepared to receive. The Spacing Guild was the institution that made interstellar civilization possible. This is not a dramatic claim, it is a statement of structural fact, as fundamental to the Imperium's existence as the statement that gravity held planetary populations on the surface of their worlds. Without the Guild, the Imperium did not function. Without the Guild's navigators, the ships did not fly, or rather, the ships flew but did not arrive, because the folding of space that made interstellar transit faster than the crawl of conventional propulsion required a form of perception that no instrument could replicate, and that only the Guild's spice transformed navigators possessed. Every political arrangement in the known universe was downstream of this fact. Every economic relationship, every military deployment, every cultural exchange, every diplomatic communication, every movement of people and goods and information between the hundreds of worlds that constituted the Padishah Imperium. All of it depended on the Guild. All of it was, in the most literal sense, at the Guild's mercy, because if the Guild withdrew its services from any world, that world was isolated. Cut off. Alone in the dark between the stars, with no way to reach or be reached by anything beyond its own atmosphere. The Guild almost never exercised this power directly. This restraint was not modesty. It was the most sophisticated political calculation in the Imperium, the understanding that a monopoly so complete needed to be exercised so carefully that its exercise was nearly invisible, because the moment the monopoly became visibly coercive was the moment every other power in the universe would begin the serious work of finding an alternative. This is the story of the Spacing Guild, not simply the story of an organization that transported people between worlds. That description is as inadequate as calling the Bene Gesserit a school for girls, or calling the Fremen a tribe of desert nomads. The Guild was the circulatory system of a civilization. Its story is the story of what happens when one institution becomes so essential that the civilization it serves cannot imagine existing without it, and what that essentiality costs the people inside the institution and the people who depend on it. The Guild's origins lay in the aftermath of the Butlerian Jihad, the great crusade against thinking machines that had shaped the political and technological landscape of the Imperium more completely than any other single event in human history. The Jihad had been a war against artificial intelligence. The machines that humanity had created to think for them had become, in the Jihad's theological and political framing, a threat to human identity itself, not simply to human safety or human freedom, but to the fundamental quality of being human that the machine's capabilities seemed to diminish. The prohibition that emerged from the Jihad was absolute. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. The prohibition covered computers, artificial intelligences, any form of machine that replicated the cognitive functions that the Jihad's architects had determined were uniquely and necessarily human. This prohibition created a vacuum. Interstellar civilization had depended on thinking machines for navigation, for the calculations that made safe transit through fold space possible, for the processing of the staggering quantities of data that navigating between star systems required. When the machines were destroyed, the navigational capability went with them. The ships still existed. The Holtzman drives that made fold space travel possible still functioned, but the capacity to use those drives safely to fold space without folding the ship and its occupants into a configuration that the laws of physics did not permit biological matter to survive, this capacity had been provided by the thinking machines, and the thinking machines were gone. The universe needed navigators. Human navigators. People who could do with biological consciousness what the thinking machines had done with artificial computation, perceive the probability space of fold space transit, identify the safe paths through the folding, guide the ships from origin to destination without the catastrophic errors that unguided fold space transit reliably produced. The spice made this possible. Melange, the substance produced by the sandworm ecology of Arrakis, the compound that had been accumulating in the human biological experience of Arrakis's inhabitants for millennia before anyone fully understood what it did, had properties that included, among its many effects on human consciousness, the capacity to expand perception into domains that ordinary consciousness could not access. At sufficient doses, in individuals with the right genetic predisposition, the spice opened a form of prescient perception that allowed the consumer to see the probability space of the near future with enough clarity to make navigational decisions that ordinary perception could not support. The first navigators were the people who discovered this capability. Not through any organized research program, the conditions immediately following the Butlerian Jihad were too chaotic for that kind of systematic development. Through the trial and error of a civilization that desperately needed what the thinking machines had provided and that was willing to explore any alternative, including the biological alternatives that the spice suggested were possible. The early navigators were, by later standards, crude. Their prescient capability was limited, their reliability was uncertain, their understanding of what they were doing was incomplete. The attrition rate was significant. Ships that attempted fold space transit with inadequately developed navigators did not always arrive, and the failures were total. Not partial failures, not ships arriving at the wrong destination or arriving with damage. Total failures. Ships that folded space and never unfolded, that disappeared from the universe as completely as if they had never existed. The Spacing Guild was founded to organize and professionalize what had been individual, scattered, uncoordinated attempts at biological navigation. The Guild's founders understood that the capability the spice provided was too valuable and too dangerous to be left to individual practitioners operating without institutional support. The navigation required training, standardization, the accumulation of institutional knowledge about what worked and what didn't, the development of protocols that maximized the probability of safe transit and minimized the catastrophic risks that unguided or inadequately guided fold space travel carried. The Guild became, over the centuries following the Jihad, the institution that the Imperium's interstellar connectivity depended on. Not by force, the Guild did not conquer its monopoly. Not by political maneuvering alone, though the Guild's political skills were formidable, by being the only institution that could reliably do the thing that everyone needed done. The monopoly was natural. In the economic sense, the cost of developing an alternative was so high, and the Guild's existing capability was so reliable that no rational actor had sufficient incentive to invest in the development of a competitor. To understand what a Guild Navigator actually was, you have to understand what the spice did to a human being when the human being was immersed in it for decades. The atmospheric spice that the Fremen of Arrakis absorbed through a lifetime of desert living produced the blue within blue eyes, the extended lifespan, the sharpened perception that characterized the deep desert population. This was the chronic, low-level version of the spice's effects, the slow accumulation of melange in the body's tissues, producing changes that were cumulative and pervasive, but that left the person recognizably human. A Fremen with blue eyes was still a Fremen. The spice had changed the surface. It had not changed the form. The navigators went further, much further. The spice concentrations that a navigator inhabited, the atmosphere of the navigation tank, measured in quantities that would have been lethal to anyone whose body had not been progressively conditioned to tolerate them, produced changes that were not simply more intense versions of what the atmospheric exposure produced. They were qualitatively different. The navigator's body, shaped by decades of immersion in concentrated melange, was not simply a human body with enhanced capabilities. It was a human body that had been transformed into something that the word human barely covered. The eyes were the first change. Not the blue within blue of the Fremen, something beyond that, a saturation so complete that the entire visible surface of the eye was a deep, uniform blue that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The skin changed next, or simultaneously, acquiring a translucency that made the blood vessels visible beneath, a quality that observers described as looking through the person rather than looking at them. The body itself changed over the longer term in ways that the sealed navigation tanks kept hidden from the Imperium's broader population, the limbs atrophying, the torso elongating, the overall morphology shifting towards something that was less bipedal humanoid and more, the accounts struggle for the comparison, aquatic, something that moved through a medium rather than on a surface. These changes were not cosmetic. They were functional. The navigator's body was being reshaped by the spice toward the configuration that made the navigational perception most effective. The atrophied limbs were unnecessary. The navigator did not need to walk, did not need to manipulate objects, did not need the locomotor capabilities that bipedal existence required. The elongated torso provided more surface area for the spice gas absorption that the navigational perception depended on. The altered morphology was the body optimizing itself. Through the spice's interaction with the biological development pathways for the function it was performing. The mind was the real transformation. The body's changes were dramatic and visible, but they were secondary, the external expression of something more fundamental happening in the navigator's consciousness. What the spice did to the navigator's mind was expand the perceptual field into the probability space that fold space transit required access to. The navigator could see, not metaphorically, not through instruments, but through the direct expansion of perceptual capacity, the paths through fold space. The safe routes, the configurations of probability that would carry a ship from one star system to another without the catastrophic errors that destroyed the unguided. This perception was prescient. It was a form of the prescient faculty that the Bene Gesserit cultivated in their reverend mothers, and that the Kwisatz Haderach expressed in its most complete form. But it was prescience of a particular kind, domain-restricted, narrowly focused, calibrated for the navigational function rather than for the broader perception of probable futures that Paul Atreides and Leto II would eventually demonstrate. The navigator could see the probability space as it related to fold space transit with a clarity that no other form of prescient consciousness matched. The navigator could not typically see the broader probability space of political and social events that the Kwisatz Haderach's vision encompassed. This domain restriction was not a limitation in the ordinary sense. It was a specialization, the development of a perceptual capability for a single function to a degree of refinement that the more generalized prescient faculty did not match in that single function's domain. A Guild Navigator was not as broadly prescient as a Kwisatz Haderach. A Guild Navigator was more precisely prescient within the navigational domain than even a Kwisatz Haderach, because the navigator's entire perceptual development had been directed toward that single function across decades of sustained spice immersion. The result was an organism. The word person is technically accurate, but inadequate, that existed in a different relationship with time and space than any unaugmented human. The navigator was present in the tank, in the physical location of the navigation chamber, in the here and now of the ship's current position. But the navigator was also present in the probability space of the ship's future positions, perceiving the paths through fold space with the direct perceptual immediacy that ordinary consciousness brought to the perception of the physical world. The navigator was, in a meaningful sense, in two places at once, in the present and in the navigated future, holding both simultaneously, using the perception of the future to guide the present toward it. The Guild's navigational monopoly was maintained through several reinforcing mechanisms, each of which is worth understanding because together they constituted one of the most durable institutional positions in the history of human civilization. The first mechanism was the spice dependency. The navigational capability that the navigators possessed was a product of sustained, intensive spice consumption. Without the spice, the perception degraded. Without the perception, the navigation was impossible. The spice came from Arrakis, from one world, one ecology, one source that could not be replicated or synthesized despite millennia of efforts by the Imperium's chemists. The Guild's monopoly on navigation was therefore downstream of the spice's monopoly on prescient augmentation, and the spice's monopoly was downstream of the sandworm ecology's monopoly on spice production. This created a dependency chain that ran from the sandworm to the navigator to the Imperium's interstellar connectivity. Every link in the chain was essential. Remove the sandworm and the spice stopped. Remove the spice and the navigators lost their capability. Remove the navigators and the ships didn't arrive. The Guild understood every link in this chain with the thoroughness that institutional survival required, and the Guild's political strategy was organized around the management of this chain's vulnerabilities. The second mechanism was the institutional knowledge. Navigation was not simply the application of the prescient faculty to the full space problem. It required training, years of training, in the institutional context that the Guild maintained, developing the perceptual capabilities through a progressive program of spice exposure and navigational practice that no individual could replicate independently. The Guild had been accumulating this institutional knowledge since its founding, refining its training methods across centuries. Developing the specific techniques that made the difference between a person with prescient capacity and a navigator who could reliably guide a ship through fold space. This knowledge was the Guild's most closely held asset. The training protocols, the progressive spice exposure regimens, the techniques for developing and maintaining the navigational perception. All of these were maintained in the Guild's institutional secrecy with a rigor that exceeded even the Bene Gesserit's legendary confidentiality. The Guild understood that its monopoly depended not only on having the spice, but on knowing what to do with it, and the knowing was the part that no external actor could easily replicate, even if they'd gained access to the spice. The third mechanism was the physical transformation itself. A person who wanted to become a navigator had to be willing to undergo the changes that sustained spice immersion produced, the progressive alteration of the body, the loss of ordinary human physical capability, the commitment to existing inside a spice gas tank for the remainder of one's life. This was not a temporary commitment or a reversible one. The transformation was irreversible. A navigator who left the tank would die. The body's dependency on the spice gas was as complete as any addiction the Imperium's pharmacology described, and the withdrawal was fatal. This irreversibility served the Guild's institutional interests in a way that was simultaneously practical and cold. The navigators could not leave. Their dependency on the Guild's spice supply was total, and their physical transformation made them incapable of existing outside the institutional framework that maintained their tanks and provided their spice. The Guild's most valuable human assets were, by the nature of their transformation, permanently bound to the institution. There was no competing offer that could lure a trained navigator away, because there was no competing institution that could maintain the conditions the navigator required to survive. The political position that the Guild occupied in the Imperium's power structure was defined by the relationship between three institutions: the Imperial throne, the Landsraad, and the Guild itself, with Chome. The Combine Honnet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, the commercial organization that managed the Imperium's economic arrangements, as the framework within which the three interacted. The balance of power was traditionally described as a tripod. The Emperor provided military force and administrative authority. The Landsraad provided the political representation of the noble houses and the collective check on imperial ambition. The Guild provided the interstellar connectivity that made everything else possible. Each leg of the tripod was necessary. None could be removed without the structure collapsing, and the balance among them was maintained by the understanding that any two legs could, in principle, combine to check the power of the third. The Guild's position in this tripod was the most defensive of the three. The Emperor had the Sardaukar, the military force that could project power onto any world in the Imperium. The Landsraad had the collective forces of the noble houses, individually weaker than the Sardaukar, but collectively capable of matching or exceeding them. The Guild had neither. The Guild's military capability was negligible. Its political authority was indirect, exercised through economic leverage rather than through the formal political mechanisms that the Emperor and the Landsraad controlled. What the Guild had was the capacity to say no, the capacity to refuse transportation, the capacity to isolate any world, any house, any political entity from the interstellar network that the Guild maintained. This capacity was the Guild's ultimate political weapon, and it was a weapon that the Guild almost never deployed, because deploying it would have exposed the monopoly to the kind of scrutiny that monopolies could not survive when the scrutiny was motivated by genuine desperation. The Guild's political strategy was, therefore, one of invisibility. Not literal invisibility. The Guild's existence was known to everyone, and the Guild's role in the Imperium's functioning was acknowledged by every political actor. Strategic invisibility, the practice of making the Guild's influence so pervasive and so routine that it became part of the background, the infrastructure that everyone depended on and no one thought about, the utility that was so reliable that the people who used it forgot that it was being provided by an institution with its own interests and its own vulnerabilities. This strategy required the Guild to avoid positions, political positions, moral positions, any form of public stance that would make the Guild visible as an actor rather than as a utility. The Guild transported goods and people without regard to the political context of the transportation. The Guild carried the Emperor's Sardaukar and the Landsraad's forces and the Bene Gesserit's agents and the Harkonnen's spice shipments and the Atreides' household and everything else that moved between worlds. Without distinction, without favoritism, without any indication that the Guild cared about the purposes for which its services were being used. This was not neutrality. Neutrality implied a choice, the decision to remain uninvolved in conflicts that one could, in principle, take sides in. The Guild's position was something more fundamental than neutrality. It was the practice of making itself so essential to all sides that all sides had an interest in maintaining the Guild's continued operation regardless of their conflicts with each other. A guild that took sides would be a guild that at least some parties had an interest in undermining. A guild that served everyone equally was a guild that everyone had an interest in preserving. The cost of this strategy was the Guild's near-total absence from the political narrative. The Imperium's historians, writing the accounts of the great events that shaped the known universe, consistently underrepresented the Guild's role, not because the Guild's role was unimportant, but because the Guild's strategy required its role to be invisible. The Guild was always there. The Guild was always providing the transportation that made the events possible. But the Guild was not a character in the events, not an actor whose decisions and motivations were examined, not a presence whose contribution to the outcome was acknowledged. The Guild preferred this. The preference was institutional, embedded in the Guild's culture and its decision-making processes at a level that individual navigators and Guild administrators might not have been fully conscious of. The institutional wisdom said, be essential, be reliable, be invisible. Let the other powers fight their wars and arrange their marriages and manage their intrigues. Transport them all, serve them all. And in the serving, maintain the position that the serving makes unassailable. The spice was the Guild's lifeline and its vulnerability simultaneously. The Guild consumed more melange than any other institution in the Imperium, not more than the total consumed by all the other consumers combined, the medical applications, the longevity market, the Bene Gesserit's institutional needs, the billions of individual consumers whose various dependencies on the substance constituted the vast majority of the total spice market. But more than any single institution, because the Guild's consumption was concentrated in its most intensive form, the navigation tanks, the sealed environments in which the navigators existed, where the spice concentration was maintained at levels that dwarfed what any other application required. This consumption created the Guild's most fundamental vulnerability. The Guild needed the spice to function. The spice came from one planet. One planet meant one point of failure, one location where disruption of the spice supply would cascade through the Guild's entire operation, degrading the navigational capability that the Imperium's connectivity depended on, threatening the institutional position that the Guild had spent millennia constructing. The Guild's political behavior was, at a deep level, organized around the management of this vulnerability. Every significant political decision the Guild made was filtered through the question of spice security. Would this decision increase or decrease the reliability of the spice supply? Would this action produce consequences that might, through the complex chains of political causation that the Imperium's power dynamics generated, eventually threaten the conditions under which the spice was produced and distributed? This filter produced a conservative political orientation that the Guild maintained across the full span of the Imperium's history. The Guild did not take risks. Not because the navigators were personally timid, The act of navigating fold space was itself the most consequential risk that any human being routinely took. A fact that the Guild's institutional culture acknowledged and even celebrated. But because the institutional calculation consistently concluded that political risk was not worth the potential return, given the catastrophic downside that disruption of the spice supply represented, the result was an institution that was simultaneously the most powerful and the most cautious actor in the Imperium's political landscape. The Guild could, in principle, have used its monopoly to reshape the political order, could have demanded changes, imposed conditions, used the threat of transportation withdrawal to force outcomes that served the Guild's interests at the expense of other actors. It did not. The institutional calculation said the current order, whatever its imperfections, provides a reliable spice supply. Any change to the order carries the risk of disrupting that supply, therefore maintain the order. Support stability. Resist change. This conservatism had consequences that the Guild's founders could not have anticipated, because the consequences played out across timescales that exceeded any individual navigator's lifespan, and that the Guild's institutional planning, however sophisticated, was not fully equipped to manage. The conservatism that protected the spice supply also prevented the Guild from adapting to changes in the political landscape that could have been managed if the Guild had been willing to take a more active role in directing them. When the Atreides transfer to Arrakis happened, when the Emperor's conspiracy to destroy House Atreides placed the most important planet in the universe at the center of a political crisis, the Guild's response was institutional paralysis. Not because the Guild lacked the capability to influence the outcome, because the Guild's institutional culture produced the assessment that any intervention carried more risk than passivity, and the assessment was not wrong in the narrow sense of risk calculation, but was catastrophically inadequate in the broader sense of failing to account for the possibility that passivity itself was a form of risk. The Guild's role in the events of Dune, in the fall of House Atreides and the rise of Paul Muad'Dib, was the first great test of the institutional strategy that had served the Guild for millennia, and the test revealed both the strategy's strengths and its fatal weakness. The Guild had been aware that something was happening on Arrakis before the Atreides transfer. The Navigator's prescient faculty, while domain restricted to the navigational function, was not entirely blind to the broader probability space. The navigational predictions were influenced by the political and military events occurring in the territories the ships were transiting, and disturbances in the probability space that were significant enough showed up as navigational anomalies that the more perceptive navigators could identify. What the Guild had seen in the probability space around Arrakis was a disturbance that their navigational prescience flagged as significant without being able to resolve into a clear picture of what was coming. Something was building on Arrakis, something that would affect the spice production, something that would alter the political landscape in ways that the navigational models were registering as increased uncertainty in the transit calculations for the Arrakeen sector. The Guild's response was to seek information. This was the institutional default. When the prescient faculty detected a disturbance, the Guild's administrative apparatus activated its intelligence networks to identify the source and assess the threat. The intelligence came back incomplete, as intelligence from Arrakis often did, because the planet's politics were managed by the Harkonnens with a specific intention to control the information that left the planet, and because the Fremen's deep desert operations were invisible to the intelligence networks that the Guild maintained through its surface-level commercial relationships. The Guild knew that the Emperor was planning something. The Guild knew that the Atreides transfer was not what it appeared. that the surface story of a routine fee-free assignment concealed a deeper political maneuver whose purpose the Guild's intelligence had not fully identified. The Guild did not know the details. The Guild did not know about the Sardaukar deployment in Harkonnen colours, about the Ewer betrayal, about the scope of the conspiracy that would destroy the Atreides and produce the conditions for Paul's transformation. What the Guild chose to do with its incomplete information was nothing. Or rather, the Guild chose to continue doing what it had always done: transport everyone, serve everyone, maintain the neutrality that had been the institutional strategy for millennia. The Guild transported the Atreides to Arrakis. The Guild transported the Sardaukar who would participate in the attack. The Guild transported the Harkonnen forces that would execute the military operation. The Guild transported everyone, with the institutional indifference that the strategy required, and the institutional indifference meant that the Guild was complicit in the destruction of House Atreides without having intended or desired or particularly cared about the destruction. This is the moral dimension of the Guild's institutional strategy, and it is the dimension that the saga examines with the most sustained attention. A strategy of serving everyone without distinction is, in a universe where some of the people being served are doing terrible things, a strategy of enabling terrible things. The Guild's transportation of the Sardaukar was not, in the Guild's institutional framing, different from any other transportation service, but the Sardaukar that the Guild transported went on to participate in the destruction of a noble house and the murder of a duke whose governance had been one of the most principled in the Landsraad. The Guild's neutrality enabled the murder. The neutrality was not the cause of the murder, and the Guild was not the murderer. But the enabling was real. Paul understood this when the Atreides heir emerged from the desert at the head of a Fremen army and confronted the political configuration that his father's destruction had produced. One of the things he understood with the Kwisatz Haderach's complete prescient clarity was the Guild's role. Not the active role. The Guild had not conspired with the Emperor or the Harkonnens. The passive role, the role of the institution that had made itself so essential and so invisible that it had enabled a conspiracy by simply continuing to do what it always did. Paul's response to the Guild at the climactic confrontation in Arrakis was calibrated to exploit the vulnerability that the Guild's strategy had created. He threatened the spice, not subtly, directly, publicly, in front of the assembled political actors whose relationships constituted the Imperium's power structure. He threatened to destroy the spice, to end the production that the Guild depended on, to remove the substance without which the navigators could not navigate, and the ships could not arrive, and the civilization could not function. The threat worked because the Guild's entire strategy had been organized around avoiding exactly this scenario. The Guild's conservatism, its refusal to take risks, its institutional commitment to maintaining the conditions under which the spice supply remained reliable, all of this had been designed to prevent a situation in which someone with the capability and the willingness to disrupt the spice supply confronted the Guild with a demand that the Guild could not refuse. Paul was that someone. He had the capability, he controlled Arrakis, or was in the process of taking control, and his control of the planet included control of the spice production facilities and the desert ecology that produced the spice. He had the willingness. The prescient vision showed him that the threat was credible, that the Guild would believe him, that the political configuration was such that the threat would produce the capitulation he needed without requiring him to actually follow through. The Guild capitulated. This was the first significant crack in the institutional position that the Guild had maintained since its founding. the first moment in which an external actor had found a lever that the Guild's strategy of invisibility and essentiality could not deflect. The Guild agreed to Paul's terms. The Guild supported his claim to the throne. The Guild did what it had always done, served the power that was ascendant, but for the first time the serving was visibly coerced rather than voluntarily offered. The Guild administrators who managed the political response to Paul's threat understood what had happened and what it meant. The institutional strategy had been revealed as insufficient. The strategy of being essential to everyone had been defeated by someone who was willing to threaten the thing the strategy was designed to protect. The lesson was clear. The Guild's monopoly, however durable, was not immune to disruption by a sufficiently capable and sufficiently desperate actor with access to the spice source. What the Guild administrators could not have anticipated was that the disruption Paul represented was not a temporary political crisis that would resolve and allow the Guild to return to its previous position. Paul was not simply a new emperor replacing an old one. Paul was the Kwisatz Haderach, a prescient consciousness of a depth and breadth that the Guild had never encountered, that saw the probability space with a clarity that the domain-restricted navigational prescience could not match, that understood the Guild's position and the Guild's vulnerabilities with a completeness that the Guild's own analysis of itself had not achieved. The age of the Guild as an independent actor was ending. The age of the Guild as a dependent institution, still essential, still providing the navigational services that the civilization required, but no longer operating with the autonomous political position it had maintained for millennia, was beginning. The conspiracy that formed against Paul Muad'Dib in the Dune Messiah period was the Guild's first attempt to recover the institutional independence that Paul's threat to the spice had compromised. And examining the Guild's participation in the conspiracy reveals something important about how the institution understood itself and what it was willing to do when the institutional survival it valued above all other considerations seemed to require action rather than passivity. The conspiracy was a collaboration. The Beni Tleilax contributed the Face Dancer Scytale and the Duncan Idaho Gola. Princess Irulan contributed her access to Paul's court and her willingness to act against the husband she had been given to for political purposes. And the Guild contributed Edric, a navigator sealed in his tank, providing the single most valuable thing the conspiracy required: prescient concealment. This was the Guild's most creative use of the prescient capability that its navigators possessed. The navigator's prescient faculty, while domain-restricted to the navigational function in its primary application, produced a side effect that had been known within the Guild for centuries, but that had never been deployed in a political context with this degree of deliberateness. The side effect was interference. The presence of a navigator's prescient field in proximity to another prescient consciousness produced a blurring of the probability space, a degradation of the clarity with which the other consciousness could perceive the futures in the navigator's vicinity. Edric's function in the conspiracy was to serve as a prescient blind spot by maintaining his presence in proximity to the conspiracy's planning, by keeping the conspiracy's participants and their activities within the zone of prescient interference that his navigator's field generated. Edric prevented Paul from seeing the conspiracy's details in the probability space. Paul could perceive the general shape of the threat, could see that something was building in the configuration of interests around him, but could not resolve the threat's details, because the navigator's interference blurred the resolution at the point where the details would have become visible. This was an elegant use of a capability that the Guild had always possessed, but had never needed to deploy in this way. The navigator's prescient interference had been a known phenomenon within the Guild's institutional knowledge. It was one of the factors that the training protocols accounted for, because multiple navigators operating in proximity could interfere with each other's perceptions in ways that the navigational function required protocols to manage. Using the interference offensively as a weapon against a rival prescient consciousness was a new application, and the fact that the Guild developed it under the pressure of the Muad'Dib threat said something about the institution's capacity for innovation when the institutional survival required it. The conspiracy's specific aims, from the Guild's perspective, were not the overthrow of Paul's rule. The Guild was not primarily interested in who sat on the throne. The institutional strategy of serving everyone without distinction made the identity of the ruler less important than the stability of the system the ruler administered. What the Guild wanted was the restoration of the conditions under which the spice supply was secure and the Guild's position was unassailable. Paul's prescient capability represented a threat to both. A consciousness that could see the probability space more clearly than the navigators could was a consciousness that could, in principle, develop alternatives to the Guild's navigational monopoly. And the mere existence of such a consciousness made the monopoly feel less secure than it had felt for millennia. The conspiracy failed, or rather, the conspiracy succeeded in some of its immediate objectives and failed in its larger purpose. The stone burner blinded Paul physically. The political pressure that the conspiracy generated destabilized the court. But Paul was not overthrown. His prescient vision continued to operate through the blindness, and the larger political configuration that his 12-year reign had produced was not reversed by the conspiracy's partial success. What the conspiracy produced in its aftermath was a changed relationship between the Guild and the other institutions of the Imperium. The Guild had been seen conspiring. This was new. For millennia, the Guild's strategy of invisibility had kept the institution out of the political narrative, had made the Guild the background against which political events occurred, rather than an actor in those events. The Dune Messiah conspiracy changed this. The Guild had taken a side. The Guild had participated in an active political intervention. The Guild had used its prescient capability as a weapon rather than as a service. The institutional damage of this exposure was significant, though the full extent of the damage would not become apparent for centuries. The exposure made the Guild visible in a way that the Guild's strategy had been specifically designed to prevent. Other actors in the Imperium now knew that the Guild was capable of political action, that the Guild was willing to deploy its capabilities in pursuit of political objectives, that the Guild's neutrality was not the fundamental principle it had been presented as, but was a strategic choice that could be abandoned when the circumstances seemed to require it. This knowledge, the knowledge that the Guild could take sides, changed the relationship between the Guild and every other actor in the political landscape. The relationships became more cautious, more calculating, more attentive to the question of what the Guild was actually doing, as opposed to what the Guild claimed to be doing. The trust that the Guild's millennia of neutrality had built was not destroyed, but it was damaged in ways that would affect the Guild's position across the centuries that followed. The Jihad years, the 12 years of Paul's reign, during which the Fremen armies moved through the Imperium in his name, had a direct and measurable impact on the Guild that the political narrative's focus on the military dimension often obscures. The Jihad was fought across hundreds of worlds. The Fremen armies that carried the Muad'Dib's name into battle across the Imperium were transported to those battles by the Guild. Every deployment, every supply shipment, every movement of troops and material from Arrakis to the worlds where the Jihad's campaigns were being conducted required the Guild's navigational services. The Guild provided these services. Not enthusiastically, the Guild's institutional preference was for stability, and the Jihad was the most destabilizing event the Imperium had experienced since the Butlerian Jihad itself. But without complaint, because the alternative to providing the services was to refuse the Muad'Dib's armies their transportation, which would have placed the Guild in direct opposition to the most powerful military and prescient consciousness the universe had ever produced. The Guild's institutional calculation concluded that providing the services was the lower risk option, and the conclusion was probably correct in the immediate term. What the Jihad did to the Guild's internal operations was less visible, but in some ways more consequential. The volume of military transportation that the Jihad required strained the Guild's navigational capacity in ways that the civilian transportation network, which was the Guild's normal operating context, did not. The navigators were working harder, navigating more frequently, managing more complex transit calculations, multiple simultaneous deployments across dispersed theatres with the urgency that military operations imposed on the transportation schedule. The strain produced casualties. Not combat casualties, the navigators were not fighters, and the navigation tanks were not on the front lines. Navigational casualties, ships that were guided through fault space by navigators who were fatigued, who were managing more transit calculations than the training protocols recommended, who were operating at the edges of their capability because the demand for navigational services exceeded the capacity that the Guild's Navigator Corps could sustain at the level of quality the protocols specified. The Guild lost ships during the Jihad. Not many. The navigators' training was robust enough that even under strain, the failure rate remained low by any reasonable standard, but more than the pre-Jihad baseline, and the increase was noticed within the Guild's internal quality monitoring systems and produced institutional anxiety that the Guild's administrators worked to manage without allowing it to affect the external perception of the Guild's reliability. The political dimension of the Jihad's impact on the Guild was even more complex. The Guild was transporting armies that were conquering worlds, that were, in the course of the Jihad's campaigns, devastating populations, disrupting economies, reshaping the political landscape of the territories they conquered. The Guild's institutional strategy said, transport everyone, serve everyone, maintain the neutrality that makes the institution essential to all sides. But the Jihad had only one side. There was no opposition to the Muad'Dib's armies that the Guild could also serve. The Jihad's military campaigns were not wars between roughly equal powers that the Guild could transport equally, but were conquests in which one side had overwhelming capability and the other side was being conquered. The Guild was transporting the conqueror. Only the conqueror. The institutional strategy of serving all sides was not available because there was only one side to serve. The Guild's neutrality in these conditions was not neutrality, it was support for the Jihad, provided under the specific conditions of a monopoly that had no choice but to serve whoever demanded service, and a political landscape that offered no alternative client to balance the demand. This produced, within the Guild's institutional culture, a discomfort that the Guild's administrators recognized but could not resolve. The Guild was not comfortable with the role that the Jihad had placed it in, the role of the essential service provider enabling a conquest that the Guild's institutional interests were not served by. But the alternative to providing the service was confrontation with the Muad'Dib, and confrontation with the Muad'Dib carried risks that the institutional calculation consistently assessed as worse than the discomfort of enabling the Jihad. The Guild endured the Jihad years. It maintained its operations, it navigated the military deployments that the Jihad required, and it navigated the civilian traffic that continued alongside the military deployments, and it managed the strain on its Navigator Corps, and the political discomfort of its institutional position. When Paul walked into the desert and the Jihad's military momentum slowed and eventually stopped, the Guild's administrators allowed themselves a cautious relief. The most destabilizing period in the Guild's post-founding history was over, and the Guild had survived it with its institutional position intact, if somewhat compromised. The Elia Regency was a period of relative normalcy for the Guild, or rather a period in which the abnormalities were political rather than existential. The Guild's position was not directly threatened during the Regency years. The Atreides court maintained the basic political framework that Paul had established. The spice continued to flow. The navigational services continued to be required and provided, and the Guild's institutional operations returned to something like the pre-Jihad baseline. What the Guild observed during the Regency years, with the intelligence networks it maintained across the Imperium's political landscape, was the progressive deterioration of the Atreides governance, the Elia possession. The Kizerate's institutional calcification, the growing distance between the court's theological pretensions and the administrative reality of governing an interstellar empire. The Guild observed these developments with the institutional detachment that the strategy required and filed them under the category of political developments that affected the Guild's operating environment without directly threatening the Guild's position. The Children of Dune period changed this assessment. The ecological crisis on Arrakis, the terraforming program's success-producing conditions that threatened the sandworm ecology and the spice production that depended on it, was the first development since Paul's initial threat that directly engaged the Guild's most fundamental institutional anxiety. The spice supply was in danger. Not from political action, not from someone threatening to destroy it, but from ecological dynamics that were outside anyone's immediate control. The Guild watched the ecological situation on Arrakis with the intensity of an institution whose survival depended on the outcome. The sandworms retreating, the desert shrinking, the moisture advancing into territories that had been arid since before human beings had arrived on the planet. The spice production declining in the zones where the ecological conditions were changing. Leto II's assumption of the God-Emperor role addressed this anxiety in a way that was simultaneously reassuring and deeply troubling. Reassuring because Leto, by integrating with the sand trout that maintained the desert ecology, was placing the ecological management of Arrakis under the control of a consciousness that understood the ecology from the inside and that had the prescient capability to manage it with unprecedented precision. Troubling because Leto's control of the ecology meant Leto's control of the spice, and Leto's control of the spice meant Leto's control of the Guild. The God-Emperor's reign, 3,500 years of the most complete governance the known universe had ever experienced, was the period in which the Guild's institutional independence was most thoroughly compromised. Leto II controlled the spice, not indirectly, not through political influence over the institutions that manage spice production on Arrakis. Directly, the spice production was a function of the ecological conditions on Arrakis, and the ecological conditions were managed by the God-Emperor personally, through the biological integration with the sand trout that gave him control over the desert's moisture balance, and therefore over the conditions under which the sandworm ecology operated and the spice was produced. The Guild received the spice that the God-Emperor chose to provide. The quantities were managed, calibrated to maintain the Guild's navigational capability at the level the civilization required, without providing enough surplus to allow the Guild to develop independent reserves or to support the development of navigational capability outside the Guild's institutional framework. The management was precise, reflecting the God Emperor's prescient understanding of the Guild's needs and vulnerabilities, and it left the Guild in a position of complete dependency on the God Emperor's continued willingness to provide. This was new. Not the dependency itself. The Guild had always been dependent on the spice, and the spice had always come from Arrakis. But the directness of the control. Under the pre-God Emperor political order, the Guild's access to the spice had been mediated by political relationships, commercial arrangements, the CHOAM framework that managed the Imperium's economic interactions. The Guild had been dependent on the spice supply, but the supply had been the product of a complex system with multiple actors whose competing interests provided the Guild with some degree of leverage and some insulation from the control of any single actor. Under the God Emperor, there was one actor, one consciousness controlling the spice supply, managing the ecological conditions that produced it, determining the quantities available and the terms under which they were available. The Guild's political position, the carefully constructed tripod of Imperial, Landsraad and Guild power that had maintained the Imperium's balance for 10,000 years, was replaced by a single leg, the God Emperor, who was all three legs simultaneously, and who did not require the Guild's independent existence for any purpose that the Guild could identify. The Guild survived the God Emperor's reign because the God Emperor chose to let it survive. This is the most uncomfortable sentence in the Guild's institutional history, and it is accurate. Leto II did not need the Guild. He could have developed alternatives, could have used his prescient capability and his control of the spice to create a navigational capacity that did not require the Guild's institutional framework, could have trained new navigators outside the Guild's control, could have allowed the Ixian navigation machine development to proceed to the point where the machines replaced the navigators entirely. He did not. He maintained the Guild because the Guild's continued existence served the Golden Path's purposes, because the post-God Emperor future needed the navigational capability that the Guild represented, and the capability was more reliably maintained within the Guild's institutional framework than in any alternative arrangement the God Emperor could have constructed. The Golden Path required the preservation of multiple institutional capabilities for the future that the God Emperor was designing, a future in which no single consciousness would be managing the civilization's trajectory, in which the institutions would need to function independently, in which the accumulated knowledge and the trained capability that the Guild represented would be genuinely needed. The Guild survived, therefore, as a managed dependency, still providing the navigational services, still maintaining the navigators, still accumulating the institutional knowledge that navigation required, but doing all of this under conditions in which the Guild's independence was a fiction maintained for the benefit of the institutional morale rather than a description of the political reality. The navigators knew. The navigational prescience, while domain-restricted, was not blind to the political landscape in which the navigation operated. The navigators could perceive, in the probability space that their prescient faculty accessed, the overwhelming presence of the God Emperor's consciousness, the way his prescient management of the civilization's trajectory appeared in the navigational calculations as a background influence that could not be separated from the calculations themselves. Navigating in the God Emperor's universe was different from navigating in the pre-God Emperor universe, because the probability space that the navigators perceived had been shaped by the God Emperor's management in ways that affected the navigational calculations at every level. Some navigators found this disturbing. The experience of perceiving a probability space that had been shaped by another consciousness, of seeing futures that were not freely evolving but were being directed toward outcomes that another prescient mind had determined, was disorienting in ways that the Guild's training protocols had not prepared for. The probability space was supposed to be a natural landscape, shaped by the aggregate of human choices and physical forces. Under the God Emperor, the probability space was a managed landscape shaped by one consciousness's deliberate intervention, and the difference was perceptible to anyone who was looking at it with prescient attention. Other navigators adapted. The management was consistent, which meant the probability space, while shaped, was predictably shaped. The navigational calculations could account for the God Emperor's influence in the same way they accounted for any other large-scale influence on the probability space, as a parameter to be factored into the transit calculations rather than as a disruption to be managed. The adaptation was functional. The navigation continued to work, the ships continued to arrive. But the institutional culture of the Guild was changed by the 3,000-year experience of operating under the God Emperor's management. The independence that had been the Guild's foundational value, the institutional autonomy that had made the Guild what it was, the self-governing quality that had sustained the institutional identity across millennia, was eroded, not destroyed. Eroded in the way that sustained dependency erodes the capabilities it replaces, not by attacking them directly, but by making them unnecessary, by providing what they were designed to provide without requiring the effort that producing it independently demanded. The Guild that emerged from the God Emperor's reign was a guild that had forgotten, in some meaningful institutional sense, what independence required. The institutional memory contained the record of independence. The navigator's other memory, to the extent that it operated, carried the experiential record of navigators who had lived and worked under conditions of institutional autonomy. But the institutional practice had been managed dependency for 35 centuries, and practice shapes institutions more than memory does. The spice hoards. This is one of the most important and least examined elements of the Guild's relationship with the God Emperor and the broader political landscape, and understanding it illuminates something about what the Guild was willing to do when the institutional survival seemed to require it. The Guild had been accumulating spice reserves since its founding. This was a prudent institutional practice. Maintaining a reserve of the substance your operations depended on was elementary risk management, the kind of thing any competent institution did with any critical resource. The Guild's reserves were large, reflecting the millennia across which they had been accumulated and the institutional priority that the reserve program received in the Guild's resource allocation. Under the God Emperor's management, the spice reserves became something more than prudent risk management. They became the Guild's hedge against the day when the management might end. The God Emperor's reign was not permanent. Even the God Emperor's prescient vision did not guarantee permanent governance. And the Guild's institutional planning operated on timescales that included the possibility, however remote it seemed during the reign's most stable periods, that the God Emperor might die or be removed, and that the spice supply might be disrupted in the transition. The reserves were maintained against this contingency. The Guild did not publicize the reserves. The institutional secrecy that characterized everything the Guild did was especially intense around the reserve program, because the reserves represented the Guild's most consequential form of independent capability, and the God Emperor's management was precisely calibrated to prevent the Guild from developing independent capability. Whether the God Emperor knew about the reserves is a question the texts do not resolve clearly. The prescient vision that gave him control over the civilization's trajectory was capable of perceiving institutional decisions of this significance, and the navigational prescience that the navigators possessed was not opaque to the God Emperor's broader prescient faculty. The most probable assessment is that the God Emperor knew, permitted the reserves accumulation because the reserves served the Golden Path's purposes. The post-God Emperor future needed a guild capable of functioning independently, and the reserves were part of the capability that independence required, and declined to draw attention to his knowledge because doing so would have compromised the institutional morale that the reserves' secrecy maintained. The reserves were used during the famine times. When the God Emperor died and the managed spice supply was disrupted, the Guild drew on its accumulated reserves to maintain navigational capability through the transition period. The reserves were not unlimited. They sustained the Guild's operations for a period that the institutional planning had estimated, but that the actual conditions of the famine times stretched to its limits. The Guild navigated the famine times on its reserves, and the reserves held barely long enough for the post-God Emperor spice supply to stabilize at levels sufficient for continued operations. This was the spice horde's vindication and their lesson. The vindication, the reserves, had served their purpose, maintaining the Guild's capability through the most significant disruption since the Butlerian Jihad. The lesson, the reserves, had been barely sufficient, which meant that the margin between the Guild's institutional survival and its institutional collapse had been narrower than the institutional planning had assumed. The Ixian navigation machines were the other threat to the Guild's monopoly, and their development across the God Emperor's reign and into the Heretics period represents the most sustained challenge the Guild faced from a technological rather than a political direction. Ix was the technology world. The Ixian culture was organized around the principle that problems which other civilizations addressed through human capability could be addressed more efficiently through machine capability, and the Ixians had spent millennia pushing the boundary of what the Butlerian Jihad's prohibition against thinking machines actually prohibited. The boundary was not as clear as the prohibition's language suggested. "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind" was a prohibition that depended on the interpretation of likeness, and the Ixians were experts at developing machines that did what human minds did, without doing it in a way that the prohibition's enforcers could identify as being in the likeness of a human mind. The navigation machines were the Ixians' most ambitious project in this boundary-pushing tradition. The machines performed navigational calculations, processed the data that fold space transit required, identified the safe paths through the folding, produced the transit solutions that guided ships from origin to destination. They did this through computational methods that were different from the prescient perception that the Guild Navigators used: mathematical modeling rather than probability space navigation, sensor data rather than prescient perception, algorithmic processing rather than direct perceptual access to the future. The machines worked. Not as reliably as the navigators, the mathematical modeling was a less complete approach to the fold space problem than the prescient perception, and the machine's solutions were sometimes suboptimal in ways that the navigators' solutions were not. But they worked well enough to be functional alternatives, and their working represented a threat to the Guild's monopoly that was qualitatively different from any political threat the Guild had faced. The political threats, Paul's threat to the spice, the God Emperor's control of the spice supply, were threats to the Guild's operating conditions. They did not threaten the Guild's essential function. Even under the most extreme political pressure, the Guild remained the only institution capable of providing the navigational services the civilization required. The Ixian machines threatened the essential function itself. They offered an alternative to the Guild's navigational capability that could, if developed sufficiently, make the Guild's navigators unnecessary. The Guild's response to the Ixian machines was the response of any institution facing a technological threat to its core function, resistance, adaptation. and the attempt to maintain the institutional position through whatever combination of technical superiority and political influence was available. The resistance was institutional. The Guild lobbied against the machines in the political forums where the Butlerian Jihad's prohibition was interpreted and enforced, arguing that the machines represented a violation of the prohibition's spirit, if not its letter. This lobbying was partially successful. The machines' legality remained contested throughout the periods in which they were being developed, and the ambiguity provided the Guild with a political tool for delaying and constraining the machine's deployment. The adaptation was operational. The Guild worked to maintain the technical superiority of the Navigators' prescient navigation over the machine's algorithmic navigation, investing in the training protocols and the spice exposure regimens that kept the Navigators' capability at levels the machines could not match. This was effective in the near term. The Navigators remained superior to the machines in the domains that mattered most for safe fold space transit, and the Guild's marketing of this superiority was convincing to the customers who valued reliability over cost. But the machines kept improving. This was the thing about technological development that the Guild's institutional culture, rooted in the biological capabilities of the Navigators rather than in the progressive improvement of manufactured systems, was not well equipped to compete with. The Navigators were what they were, the product of decades of spice immersion trained to the limits of human prescient capability, performing at a level that was already as close to optimal as biological systems could achieve. The machines were what they were becoming, the product of continuous improvement, of iterative refinement, of the kind of progressive optimization that manufactured systems were capable of, and that biological systems, once they had reached their developmental limits, were not. The trajectory was clear to anyone who could see it. The machines would eventually match and then exceed the Navigators' capability. Not soon, the gap between the machine's current performance and the Navigators' performance was substantial, and closing it would take centuries of development. But eventually. The trajectory was not debatable. The Guild saw this trajectory, and the seeing produced institutional anxiety that was managed but not resolved across the centuries during which the machines were being developed. The Guild's institutional planning operated on timescales that included the eventual replacement of Navigators by machines, and the planning's conclusion was uncomfortable when the machines matched the Navigators. The Guild's monopoly would end. Not immediately. Institutional momentum and customer loyalty and the political relationships the Guild had cultivated would sustain the Guild's position for some time after the technical monopoly was broken. But eventually, the monopoly would end, and the Guild would have to find a new basis for its institutional existence. This is the existential challenge that the Heretics period found the Guild confronting. Not the immediate challenge of the Honoured Matras or the burning of Arrakis, but the deeper, slower, more fundamental challenge of a technological development that was making the Guild's core function reproducible by machines that did not require spice or sealed tanks or the transformation of human beings into something other than human. The burning of Arrakis changed everything. When the Honoured Matras destroyed Arrakis, glassing the planet, incinerating the sandworm ecology, ending the spice production that had been the foundation of the Imperium's economy for 10,000 years, the Guild's institutional position underwent its most radical transformation since the founding. The spice was gone. Not depleted, not reduced, not disrupted in the temporary way that political crises had disrupted it before. Gone, the ecology that produced it was destroyed. The planet that had been its only source was a glass plane, the substance that the Navigators required for their prescient capability, that the Guild had been organizing its entire institutional existence around since the post-Butlerian Jihad founding, was no longer being produced. The Guild's reserves, the accumulated stockpiles that had been maintained across millennia, became the Guild's lifeline. The reserves were finite. Every unit of spice consumed by a navigator was a unit that could not be replaced from the source that had always replenished the supply. The institutional calculus changed from the management of a renewable resource to the management of a diminishing asset, from the question of how to maintain a reliable supply to the question of how to make a fixed supply last as long as possible. This produced changes in the Guild's operations that were immediate and consequential. The navigational services continued, the civilization still needed them. The alternative of reverting to non-navigated fault-based transit was not acceptable given the catastrophic failure rates that unguided transit produced, but the services were rationed. Not openly. The Guild's institutional strategy of maintaining the appearance of uninterrupted reliability was too important to abandon even under these conditions. But internally, the Guild began the process of prioritizing which transits received full navigational attention and which received reduced attention, of managing the spice consumption of the Navigator Corps to extend the reserve's duration, of calibrating the operational tempo to the reality of a diminishing rather than a renewable resource. The Ixian machines, in this context, became not the threat the Guild had been managing, but the alternative the Guild was forced to contemplate. If the spice was gone, if the reserves would eventually be exhausted and the navigational prescience would degrade as the spice dependency's biological reality asserted itself, then the machines were no longer the enemy of the Guild's monopoly. They were the successor technology that the Guild needed to adopt in order to survive as an institution after the Navigator's prescient capability had been degraded past the point of functionality. This was a reversal so complete that the Guild's institutional culture struggled to process it. For millennia, the Guild had defined itself in opposition to the machines, had positioned the Navigator's biological prescience as the irreplaceable, non-reproducible capability that justified the Guild's monopoly. Now the machines were the thing that might sustain the Guild after the biological prescience was no longer available. The identity crisis this produced in the Guild's institutional culture was profound, and the Heretics period's portrayal of the Guild reflects this crisis in the diminished confidence and the institutional uncertainty that characterized the Guild's decision-making during this era. The chapter house worm, the single sandworm specimen that the Bene Gesserit had carried from Arrakis before the destruction, from which the sandtrout were beginning the slow process of establishing a new worm ecology on Chapter House, was the only hope for the eventual restoration of the spice supply. The Guild knew about the Chapter House ecology. The Guild's institutional interest in the ecology's success was as intense as any interest the Guild had ever had in any development anywhere, because the ecology's success would eventually mean the restoration of the spice supply, the replenishment of the reserves, the continuation of the Navigator's prescient capability. But the timescales were geological. The sandtrout would need decades to establish the desert conditions the worm ecology required. The worms would need decades more to develop to the scale that spice production required. The spice production would need years to reach the quantities that the Guild's operations demanded. The total timeline from the Chapter House ecology's establishment to the restoration of adequate spice supply was measured in centuries at minimum, longer than the Guild's reserves could sustain the Navigator Corps at its current operational tempo. The Guild was facing the prospect of a bridge that its reserves could not span. The bridge from the destruction of Arrakis to the maturation of the Chapter House ecology was longer than the reserves could sustain, which meant that at some point during the bridge period, the Navigator's prescient capability would begin to degrade, the navigational services would begin to deteriorate, and the Guild would begin the slow decline that the institutional planning had been designed to prevent. This was the context in which the Guild's relationship with the Ixian machines transformed from opposition to adoption. The machines were the bridge technology, the capability that could sustain the navigational function during the period when the spice was unavailable and the navigator core was degrading. The machines were not as good as the navigators, but they were good enough to prevent the civilization's interstellar connectivity from collapsing entirely during the bridge period, and good enough was, under the circumstances, the best available option. The no-ship's departure from Chapter House carried consequences for the Guild that the departure's architects had not primarily been thinking about. The no-ship carried sandworms. This meant the no-ship carried the spice ecology, the biological system that would, wherever the no-ship eventually stopped, establish a new desert, produce new worms, generate new spice. The spice ecology was going somewhere that the Guild could not follow, because the no-ship was invisible to prescient vision, to conventional detection, to any form of tracking that the known universe's technology could provide. The Guild could not find the no-ship. The navigational prescience that might have tracked its trajectory was degrading as the spice reserves diminished. The machines that might have provided an alternative tracking capability were not designed for the pursuit of invisible targets. The no-ship was gone, into the dark beyond the maps, carrying the spice ecology with it. This meant that the future of the spice, the long-term future, the future in which the Chapter House ecology matured and the spice was once again available in quantities sufficient for the Guild's needs, was not the only possible future. There was another future, somewhere in the dark, where the spice ecology was establishing itself on a world the Guild had never seen, producing spice for people the Guild would never meet, generating the substance the Guild needed in a location the Guild could not reach. The Guild's institutional planning, which had been based on the assumption that the Chapter House ecology was the only path to the spice's restoration, had to accommodate this additional possibility, the possibility that the spice would return somewhere, but not necessarily where the Guild was. The planning's conclusion was that the Guild needed to maintain its institutional capability through the bridge period by whatever means were available, so that when the spice returned, whether from Chapter House or from wherever the no-ship's worms established themselves, the Guild would still exist to use it. The Ixian machines were part of this maintenance strategy. The Guild's investment in the machines, which had once been the grudging acknowledgement of a threat and had then become the desperate adoption of a bridge technology, became, in the post-Chapter House era, the primary operational strategy. The machines could navigate. The machines did not need spice. The machines could sustain the Guild's function through the bridge period without consuming the dwindling reserves that the remaining navigators depended on. The navigators became, in this new operational context, the Guild's most precious and most diminishing asset. Each navigator represented decades of training and decades of accumulated prescient capability that could not be replaced when the navigator died or when the spice reserves were insufficient to maintain the navigator's tank. The navigators were being conserved, deployed only for the most critical transits, reserved for the situations where the machine's limitations made the prescient faculty necessary, managed as a declining resource that had to be used with the maximum possible efficiency. This was the reversal of the Guild's entire institutional history. For millennia, the navigators had been the institution, the people around whom everything else was organized, the capability that everything else served. Now the navigators were the legacy system, the old technology being managed toward its end, while the new technology took over the functions the old technology could no longer sustain. The institutional identity crisis deepened. What was the Guild, if not the institution that provided navigators? What was the Guild's value, if the navigation could be done by machines? What distinguished the Guild from any other transportation company if the distinguishing capability, the prescient navigation that only the navigators could provide, was being replaced by machines that any institution with sufficient Ixian contacts and sufficient investment capital could acquire? These questions did not have comfortable answers, and the Guild's institutional leadership in the Heretics and Chapterhouse periods was visibly struggling with them. The Guild was in the process of becoming something other than what it had been, not by choice, not through the kind of deliberate transformation that an institution undertakes when it sees a better form for itself, but through the forced adaptation of an institution whose foundational capability was being eroded by circumstances it could not control. What it was like to be a Guild navigator is a question that the texts address obliquely rather than directly, because the navigators themselves were among the most inaccessible consciousnesses in the Imperium, sealed in their tanks, communicating through intermediaries, rarely speaking to anyone outside the Guild's institutional hierarchy in terms that were not mediated by the Guild's diplomatic apparatus. The fragments that survive in the saga's narrative, the glimpses of navigator consciousness that the texts provide through encounters with other characters who had reason to interact with navigators, suggest an experience of reality that was as far from ordinary human experience as any biological consciousness had achieved while remaining, in the technical sense, a human consciousness. The navigator perceived time differently, not in the dramatic sense of time dilation or time travel. The physical time that the navigator's body experienced was the same physical time that everyone else experienced. But the perceptual time, the time that the navigator's consciousness experienced, was different, because the prescient faculty's continuous operation meant that the navigator was always partially in the future. The present moment, for a navigator, was not a single point on a timeline. It was a region, a zone of perception that included the present and the near future simultaneously, the navigational probability space unfolding in the navigator's awareness alongside the immediate sensory reality of the tank. This double perception, the present and the probable future, experienced concurrently, produced a quality of consciousness that people who interacted with navigators consistently described as displaced. The navigator was present, but not entirely present, attending to the conversation, but also attending to the probability space that the conversation existed within, seeing the person in front of them, and seeing the probable futures that the person's choices were generating. The experience of talking to a navigator was reportedly the experience of talking to someone who already knew how the conversation would end and who was managing their responses accordingly. The loneliness that this perceptual difference produced was not the loneliness of physical isolation. Though the physical isolation was real, the tank was sealed, the navigator did not leave, the life inside the tank was the life of a consciousness that had traded the physical world for the perceptual one. The loneliness was the loneliness of perceptual incompatibility. The navigator could not fully share what they were experiencing with anyone who was not a navigator, because the experience of concurrent present and future perception was not translatable into the vocabulary of present-only consciousness. You could describe it. You could not transmit it. The gap between describing and experiencing was the gap that made every navigator, to some degree, alone. The Guild's institutional culture addressed this loneliness through the community of navigators, the network of sealed tanks, connected through the Guild's communication systems, in which navigators could interact with others who shared their perceptual condition. The navigator community was the closest thing the navigators had to a peer group, people who understood, from the inside. What the double perception was like, who could communicate about it in terms that did not require the translation into present-only vocabulary that communication with non-navigators demanded. This community was also the Guild's institutional mechanism for quality control and knowledge transmission. Navigational expertise was developed through the interaction of navigators with each other, through the sharing of techniques, the comparison of perceptual experiences, the accumulated knowledge of what worked and what didn't that the community generated and maintained. The navigator community was the Guild's institutional memory, carried not in written records but in the living experience of navigators who had been navigating for decades and who transmitted their accumulated expertise to the newer members of the community through the specific form of interaction that the navigator community supported. The community produced its own culture. This is an aspect of the Guild's existence that the saga mentions but does not explore in detail, and the absence of detailed exploration is itself a reflection of the Guild's institutional secrecy. What can be inferred from the fragments is that the navigator culture was a culture of perception, organized around the experience of seeing the probability space, developed through the sustained attention to the perceptual dimension that was the navigator's primary relationship with reality. The navigators had preferences. They had aesthetic judgments about transit solutions. Some solutions were considered more elegant than others, not simply more efficient, but more beautiful in the way that mathematical proofs could be beautiful. The way that a solution that achieved its objective with minimum waste and maximum precision could produce a response in the consciousness that appreciated it, that was not purely utilitarian, but was something more. The navigators had a concept of navigational artistry that distinguished the competent from the elegant, the functional from the inspired. The solution that worked from the solution that worked, and was also right in a way that the navigator's trained perception could recognize and appreciate. This artistry was the navigator culture's highest value, the thing that the community recognized and celebrated in its members, the quality that the most accomplished navigators were known for within the community. A navigator who could find the most elegant path through fold space, the path that was not simply safe but was optimally safe, that used the probability space's structure rather than fighting it, that achieved the transit with a quality of precision that the navigator's perceptual faculty could appreciate as the perceptual equivalent of a perfectly executed performance. Such a navigator was the community's artist, respected for a quality that no one outside the community could fully evaluate. The economic dimension of the Guild's existence was managed through CHOME, the Combine Honit Ober Advancer Mercantiles, the commercial organization that served as the Imperium's economic management framework. CHOME was not simply a trading company. It was the economic infrastructure of the Imperium, the framework within which the production, distribution, and consumption of the known universe's goods and services were organized. Every major economic actor in the Imperium, the noble houses, the Bene Gesserit, the Guild itself, held shares in CHOME, and the distribution of those shares reflected the distribution of economic power in the political landscape. The Guild's CHOME position was defined by its monopoly. The Guild held shares that reflected the value of the navigational services it provided, shares whose value was derived from the fact that the Guild's services were essential and non-substitutable. That every economic transaction that involved the movement of goods or people between worlds depended on the Guild's participation. This made the Guild's CHOME shares among the most valuable in the organization, and the value gave the Guild economic leverage that supplemented its political leverage and reinforced its institutional position. The spice trade was the economic relationship that connected the Guild most directly to CHOME's operations. The spice was the Imperium's most valuable commodity, more valuable per unit weight than any other substance in the known universe, more consequential for the civilization's functioning than any other product of any other economy. The spice trade was managed through Chome, and the Guild was Chome's most important customer for the spice, consuming quantities that represented a significant fraction of the total production. The pricing of the Guild's spice consumption was one of the most politically charged elements of the Chome framework. The Guild's dependency on the spice gave the spice's producers, whoever controlled Arrakis at any given time, leverage over the Guild that the Guild's own leverage over the transportation network did not fully counterbalance. The result was a perpetual negotiation between the Guild and the spice producers, mediated through Chome's commercial framework, in which the Guild's transportation monopoly was weighed against the spice producers' resource monopoly in an ongoing process of economic mutual dependency. Under the Harkonnens, this negotiation had been managed through the standard Chome mechanisms: contracts, pricing agreements, delivery schedules that balance the Harkonnens' interest in maximizing spice revenue against the Guild's interest in minimizing spice cost. The relationship was transactional and unremarkable by the standards of the Chome framework. Under Paul Muad'Dib, the relationship became politically charged in ways that the Chome framework was not designed to manage. Paul's control of Arrakis and his willingness to threaten the spice gave him leverage over the Guild that exceeded anything the Chome pricing mechanisms could balance. The economic relationship became, in effect, a political relationship, the terms of the Guild's spice access determined not by commercial negotiation but by political accommodation with a ruler who had the capability and the demonstrated willingness to disrupt the entire system if his terms were not met. Under the God Emperor, the economic relationship became irrelevant in its Chome dimension because the God Emperor controlled everything: the spice, the transportation, the political authority, the economic framework. Chome continued to exist as an institutional form, but its function as a framework for managing competing economic interests was hollowed out by the God Emperor's comprehensive control. The post-God Emperor restoration of Chome's economic function was incomplete and contested, reflecting the broader political fragmentation that the famine times and the scattering had produced. The economic relationships that had been organized through Chome for 10,000 years were disrupted, reorganized around new actors and new power configurations. And the Guild's position within the reorganized framework was diminished, not because the Guild's services were less valuable, but because the Guild's institutional capability was degrading along with the spice reserves and the navigator corps that the reserves sustained. The relationship between the Guild and the Fremen is worth examining because it illuminates an aspect of the Guild's institutional behavior that the political narrative often obscures: the Guild's capacity for pragmatic accommodation with any actor that could threaten the spice supply. The Fremen had been bribing the Guild for centuries before the events of Dune. This bribery, the payment of spice to the Guild in exchange for the Guild's cooperation in maintaining the satellite surveillance blind spots that kept the Fremen's deep desert activities invisible to the Imperium's administrative apparatus, was one of the most consequential covert relationships in the pre-Paul political landscape. The operational mechanism was built on layers of deniability. The Guild controlled the satellites that provided orbital surveillance of Arrakis, the Highliners carried the surveillance equipment into orbit, and the Guild's operational infrastructure included the data management systems that the surveillance generated. The Fremen, through channels refined over generations of covert interaction, provided spice. Quantities accumulated through the desert community's discipline and patience skimmed from the desert's production through methods the Harkonnen accounting could not detect. In exchange, the Guild ensured that the satellite coverage maintained blind spots, gaps positioned over the deep desert territories where the sietches were located, where the terraforming program's hidden work was advancing, where the population that the official surveys drastically underestimated was living its concealed existence. The arrangement was maintained through the Guild's representatives on Arrakis, commercial agents who managed the Guild's planetary presence and who served as intermediaries between the Fremen's concealed leadership and the Guild's institutional decision-makers. These representatives were among the few non-Fremen who understood what the Fremen actually were, not the scattered nomadic bands the Harkonnen reports described, but a civilization of millions, organized and disciplined and building towards something that no outsider had been permitted to see clearly. The representatives reported their observations through the Guild's internal channels, and the reports were filed with the institutional thoroughness the Guild brought to all intelligence. The Guild's administrators assessed the reports, concluded year after year that the arrangement served the Guild's interests, and maintained the concealment with the same attention to operational security that characterized the Guild's management of its own institutional secrets. The Guild knew that the Fremen population was larger than the official surveys suggested. The Guild knew because the satellite coverage that the Guild provided was deliberately incomplete in the ways the Fremen bribery required, that the desert contained communities whose scale and capability the Harkonnen administration was not aware of. The Guild knew this and said nothing, because saying something would have disrupted the bribery arrangement, and the bribery arrangement provided the Guild with spice outside the Chom accounting, spice that supplemented the commercially acquired supply, spice that the Guild's institutional interest in maintaining maximum reserves made valuable regardless of its political implications. This was the Guild's pragmatism at its most revealing. The institution that claimed neutrality, that positioned itself as the impartial transportation utility serving all sides without distinction, was actively cooperating with the Fremen in concealing information that the Harkonnen administration and the Imperial government would have found important. The cooperation was not ideological. The Guild had no interest in the Fremen's political aspirations or ecological programs. The cooperation was transactional. The Fremen had spice. The Guild wanted spice, and the price of the spice was the Guild's silent participation in the concealment of the Fremen's capabilities. The consequences of this concealment were enormous. The Harkonnen administration's failure to accurately assess the Fremen population and capability was a contributing factor in the military catastrophe that destroyed the Harkonnen position on Arrakis when Paul led the Fremen to war. The catastrophe's roots were complex. The Harkonnen administration would have failed to assess the Fremen accurately, even without the Guild's cooperation in concealment, because the administration's intelligence apparatus was not configured for the kind of curiosity that accurate assessment required. But the Guild's cooperation was a factor, and the factor's consequences included the destruction of a noble house and the death of thousands of Harkonnen troops who were not prepared for what they encountered. The Guild's institutional assessment of this consequence was characteristically pragmatic. The destruction of the Harkonnens on Arrakis was unfortunate, but did not directly threaten the spice supply, which was the Guild's primary institutional concern. The new regime, Paul's regime, would need the spice produced as much as the old regime had, and the Guild would provide the transportation services the new regime required with the same institutional indifference it had provided them to the old. Thufir Hawat, the Atreides Mentat, had identified the Guild's complicity in the Fremen concealment during his analysis of Arrakis's political landscape. The identification was one of the factors that informed the Atreides' understanding of the political environment they were entering. The realization that the Guild, despite its neutral public posture, was an active participant in the information management that characterized Arrakis' politics. Harwott's analysis concluded that the Guild's behavior was predictable once the underlying motivation was understood. The Guild would do whatever the spice required, regardless of the political or moral implications, and any actor who wanted to predict the Guild's behavior needed only to identify the option that maximized the Guild's spice security. This analytical framework proved accurate not only for the Atreides period, but for the Guild's behavior across the entire span of the saga. The Guild's decisions, assessed through the lens of spice security, were consistently predictable. The Guild cooperated with the Fremen because the Fremen had spice. The Guild capitulated to Paul because Paul controlled the spice. The Guild participated in the Dune Messiah conspiracy because Paul's prescient capability threatened the conditions under which the spice supply was secure. The Guild accommodated the God Emperor because the God Emperor controlled the spice with a directness that made accommodation the only viable option. Spice first, everything else second. This was not a philosophy that the Guild articulated publicly. The institutional strategy of invisibility and neutrality was the public face, but it was the operating principle that drove the Guild's behavior at every decision point that mattered, and understanding it is essential for understanding the Guild's role in the Imperium's history. The Guild's internal governance structure was hierarchical in the way that any institution organized around a scarce and specialized capability was hierarchical, the navigators at the apex, the administrative and support personnel beneath, the commercial operations and political liaison functions at the base. The hierarchy was not contested. The navigator's position at the top was not a political arrangement that had been established through negotiation or power struggle. It was a structural reality, grounded in the fact that the navigators were the Guild, and everything else was the institutional framework that supported the navigator's function. The administrative personnel did not aspire to replace the navigators. The commercial operations did not imagine that their contribution was more important than the navigational capability they existed to support. The hierarchy was as natural as the hierarchy of a hospital organized around its surgeons. The people who performed the institution's core function occupied the core position, and everyone else organized around them. The Guild's administrators, the people who managed the institution's political relationships, its commercial operations, its personnel systems, its spice procurement, and its reserve management, were competent rather than exceptional by the standards of the Imperium's institutional managers. This was a deliberate institutional choice rather than a failure of recruitment. The Guild did not want exceptional administrators. People of exceptional capability might develop independent institutional ambitions that could disrupt the institutional stability the Guild valued above all other administrative qualities. The Guild wanted competent, reliable, predictable administrators who would maintain the institutional framework without attempting to reshape it. This preference for administrative predictability over administrative brilliance was one of the Guild's institutional limitations. The administrators who managed the Guild's political relationships across the millennia of the Imperium's history were good enough to maintain the relationships, good enough to manage the commercial operations, good enough to sustain the institutional framework. They were not good enough to anticipate the kinds of disruptions that Paul Muad'Dib and the God Emperor represented, because anticipating those disruptions would have required the kind of independent political thinking that the Guild's institutional culture actively discouraged. The result was an institution that was extraordinarily good at managing routine and extraordinarily bad at managing crisis. The Guild's response to the predictable was exemplary: the routine navigation, the standard commercial operations, the ordinary political relationships that constituted the day-to-day management of an interstellar transportation monopoly. The Guild's response to the unprecedented, Paul's threat, the God Emperor's control, the honoured mattress's destruction of Arrakis, was consistently inadequate, because the institutional culture that produced excellent routine management was the same institutional culture that prevented the creative crisis response that the unprecedented required. The philosophical dimension of the Guild, what the Guild's existence said about the Imperium and about the human relationship with power and dependency, is the dimension that Herbert was most interested in and that the narrative examines with the most sustained attention. The Guild was a metaphor. Not only a metaphor, the Guild was also a genuine institution with genuine political consequences. And the narrative treats it as both simultaneously. But the metaphorical dimension was the one that gave the Guild its resonance beyond the immediate narrative context, and examining it illuminates something about what Herbert was exploring across the 6 novels. The metaphor was dependency. The Guild represented the ultimate expression of what happens when a civilization becomes dependent on a single institution for a function it cannot perform itself, when the outsourcing of a critical capability to a specialized provider becomes so complete that the capability is no longer available outside the provider. And the provider's continued operation becomes an existential necessity rather than a commercial convenience. The Imperium's dependency on the Guild was total. Not because the Imperium lacked the intelligence to develop alternatives, the Ixian machines demonstrated that alternatives were possible. Not because the Imperium lacked the resources to invest in alternative development, the wealth of the Landsraad houses and the Imperial treasury was more than sufficient for the development of navigational alternatives. The dependency was total because the Guild's monopoly had lasted so long and had been so reliable that the institutional will to develop alternatives had never been sufficient to overcome the institutional inertia that the monopoly's reliability produced. Why invest in developing something you already have? This is the question that maintains every monopoly, and it is the question that the Guild's existence posed to the entire civilization it served. The Guild was there. The Guild worked. The navigation was reliable. The ships arrived. Why would any rational actor invest the enormous resources that the development of an alternative would require when the existing service was available and functional? The answer that the saga eventually demonstrated, was that the dependency itself was the risk. The Guild's monopoly was not a stable condition. It was a vulnerability, a single point of failure in a civilization that spanned hundreds of worlds and that depended, for its most fundamental form of connectivity, on a single institution whose continued operation depended on a single substance produced on a single planet by a single ecology that no human effort could replicate. The vulnerability was not hypothetical. Paul demonstrated it when he threatened the spice. The God Emperor demonstrated it when he managed the spice supply directly. The honoured matras demonstrated it when they destroyed the planet. Each demonstration showed, in different ways, that the dependency the Guild had cultivated and that the Imperium had permitted was a structural weakness that could be exploited by any actor who was willing to threaten the thing the dependency depended on. Herbert was not making a simple argument against monopolies or against dependency. The argument was more nuanced than that. The Guild's monopoly had served the civilization well for millennia, providing reliable transportation, maintaining interstellar connectivity, sustaining the economic and political and cultural relationships that made the Imperium a civilization rather than a collection of isolated worlds. The monopoly was not bad in itself. The dependency that the monopoly produced was not irrational. It was the rational response of a civilization to a reliable service provider. What Herbert was exploring was the dynamic between reliability and vulnerability, the way that the very reliability of a monopoly made the vulnerability it created invisible, the way that sustained good performance created the conditions for catastrophic failure by eliminating the incentive to develop alternatives. The Guild's story is the story of what happens when a civilization trusts too completely in a single institution, not because the trust is unjustified in any given moment, but because the cumulative effect of sustained trust is the erosion of the capacity for self-reliance that the trust replaces. The Butlerian Jihad had been, in a sense, about the same thing. The jihad was the violent response to the realization that humanity had become dependent on thinking machines, that the outsourcing of cognitive functions to artificial intelligences had produced a dependency that threatened human identity and human autonomy. The jihad's solution was prohibition: destroy the machines, eliminate the dependency. Force humanity to develop the capabilities that the machines had been providing. The Guild was, in this reading, the jihad's ironic offspring. The jihad destroyed the machine dependency and replaced it with a different dependency, the dependency on biological navigators whose prescient faculty replaced the computational capability the machines had provided. The civilization had eliminated its dependency on thinking machines and had immediately developed a dependency on spice-augmented human beings that was, in its structural character, identical to the dependency the jihad had eliminated. This irony, the replacement of one dependency with another structurally equivalent dependency, was part of Herbert's larger argument about the human relationship with critical capabilities. The argument was not that dependency was always wrong or that self-reliance was always achievable. The argument was that the human tendency to develop dependencies, to find someone or something that could perform a critical function and to outsource the function rather than maintaining the capability independently, was a recurring pattern that produced recurring vulnerabilities, regardless of whether the thing being depended on was a thinking machine or a spice-augmented human being. The Guild was the most complete expression of this pattern. The Navigators were the most specialized, the most transformed, the most completely committed expression of the human capability for developing biological alternatives to the machine capabilities the Jihad had destroyed. And the civilization's dependency on them was the most complete expression of the human tendency to trade self-reliance for reliability. To outsource the critical function to the specialist and then forget, across millennia of the specialist's reliable performance, that the outsourcing was a choice rather than an inevitability. The Guild's relationship with the honoured maîtres was the final chapter of the institution's story in the completed saga, and it illuminated the Guild's adaptability and the limits of that adaptability under conditions of existential threat. The honoured maîtres did not particularly care about the Guild. This was itself significant. The Guild, which had spent millennia carefully managing its relationships with every power in the Imperium, which had invested enormous institutional effort in making itself essential to every actor in the political landscape, found itself confronting an actor that did not need what the Guild provided, and did not value what the Guild was. The honoured maîtres had their own transportation. Not guild navigation, the honoured maîtres had developed, in the uncharted dark of the scattering, navigational capabilities that did not depend on the Guild's institutional framework or the Guild's spice augmented navigators. The capabilities' origins were not fully described in the saga. They were part of the broader mystery of what the scattered populations had encountered and developed in the territory beyond the known universe's borders. But they were functional. The Honored Martyrs could move between worlds without the Guild's assistance. This made the Guild irrelevant to the Honored Martyrs in a way that no previous actor had made it irrelevant. The Emperor had needed the Guild. The Landsraad had needed the Guild. Paul had needed the Guild, even as he threatened it. The God Emperor had needed the Guild, even as he managed it. Every previous actor in the Imperium's political history had depended on the Guild's services to some degree, and that dependency had given the Guild its political position and its institutional leverage. The Honored Martyrs did not depend. They had alternatives. The Guild's most fundamental institutional asset, the asset that had sustained its political position for millennia, was worthless in the confrontation with the Honored Martyrs, because the asset's value derived from being non-substitutable, and the Honored Martyrs had demonstrated that it could be substituted. The Guild's response to this irrelevance was the response of any institution confronting the revelation that its core value proposition has been replicated. Institutional crisis, followed by the attempt to identify what, if anything, the institution could offer that the replacement could not. The Navigator's prescient perception was the remaining differentiator. The Ixian machines could navigate, but they could not perceive the probability space. The Honored Mattress's navigational capability, whatever its mechanism, did not include the prescient dimension that the Guild's navigators provided. The prescient perception was the thing that the Guild could offer that no alternative could replicate, the one capability that remained non-substitutable even after the navigational monopoly had been broken by the machine's development and the Honored Mattress's alternative. But the prescient perception was degrading. The spice reserves were diminishing, the navigator core was declining. The capability that remained the Guild's only differentiator was itself in the process of deteriorating, and the deterioration could not be reversed without a spice supply that was not available in the quantities the maintenance required. The Guild's institutional trajectory in the Heretics and Chapter House period was therefore a trajectory of managed decline. Not collapse. The decline was managed, controlled, calibrated to extend the institution's capability as long as possible, to maintain the navigational function through the bridge period, to preserve whatever could be preserved for the future that the bridge was leading toward. But decline nonetheless. The most powerful institution in the Imperium's history, the institution that had made interstellar civilization possible, that had held the political balance for 10,000 years, that had accumulated the most durable monopoly any institution had ever possessed, was diminishing. The Bene Gesserit's absorption of the Honored Matres in the Chapter House period offered a potential pathway for the Guild's institutional survival that the Guild's own institutional resources could not provide. The merged institution, the combination of Bene Gesserit discipline and Honored Matre capability that Mobela's leadership was producing, had access to navigational alternatives and to political influence that could sustain the Guild's institutional existence even as the Guild's own capability declined. The relationship was one of dependency, the Guild depending on the merged institution's willingness to maintain it, and the dependency was ironic in the way that all of the Guild's dependencies had been ironic. The institution that had built its existence on making others depend on it was now depending on others for its own survival. There is a final dimension of the Guild's story that deserves attention, because it connects the Guild to the deepest argument the saga makes about the relationship between human capability and human form. The navigators had given up their humanity, not in the moral sense, not in the sense that they had become cruel or indifferent, or that they had lost the qualities that the word humanity used in its moral dimension described. In the physical sense, they had traded their human bodies for the capability that the spice transformation provided. They had given up walking, eating ordinary food, touching other human beings, existing in the open air, seeing the sky without the mediation of the tank's walls. They had given up everything that the human physical experience included in exchange for the perceptual capability that the navigational function required. This trade was voluntary, at least in its initial stages. Nobody was forced to become a navigator. The candidates who entered the Guild's training program did so by choice, motivated by whatever combination of ambition and curiosity and the human desire for capability that the prospect of prescient perception might inspire. The training was progressive, the transformation was gradual, and the early stages were, at least theoretically, reversible. A candidate who decided during the early training that the price was too high could withdraw, return to ordinary life, resume the human physical experience that the training was in the process of replacing. But the later stages were not reversible. At some point in the transformation, a point that the Guild's medical literature documented with precision, but that varied across individual candidates, the biological changes became irreversible. The body's dependency on the spice gas became absolute. The physical transformation, the morphological changes that were reshaping the body from bipedal humanoid towards something more adapted to the tank's medium, could not be reversed. The candidate who had entered the training as a human being emerged, eventually, as something else. The something else was capable, extraordinarily capable in the navigational domain that justified the transformation, but it was no longer the thing it had been. The navigator was a human consciousness in a non-human body, performing a function that required the non-human body's capabilities, living a life that was defined by the function rather than by the broader range of experiences that an unaugmented human life included. This is the same trade that Leto II made when he allowed the sand trout to cover him. The same structural trade, human form exchanged for capability, human physical experience surrendered in service of a function that the original form could not perform. The navigator's trade was less dramatic than the god emperor's. The navigators did not rule the universe, did not spend 3,500 years as something inhuman, did not design their own deaths as part of a species saving project. But the structural similarity is there, and examining it illuminates something that Herbert was consistently interested in, the relationship between what human beings are and what human beings can become, and the cost of the becoming. The Guild Navigators were, in this reading, the Imperium's most visible demonstration of the price of critical capability. The civilization needed what the Navigators could do. The Navigators could only do it by ceasing to be what they had been. The price was paid by the individuals who underwent the transformation, and the payment was permanent. Not a temporary sacrifice that could be recovered from when the function was no longer needed, but an irreversible change that defined the remainder of the individual's existence. The civilization accepted this price. Not enthusiastically, not with celebration. The navigators were not heroes in the cultural narrative, not figures whose sacrifice was honored with the kind of recognition that military sacrifice received. The navigators were functionaries, essential functionaries, indispensable functionaries, but functionaries, people who performed a function, valued for the function rather than for themselves, acknowledged for what they provided rather than for what they had given up to provide it. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable thing the Guild's story reveals about the civilization it served. The Imperium was willing to accept the transformation of human beings into non-human specialists as the price of interstellar connectivity. And the acceptance was so complete and so routine that the moral dimension of the acceptance was invisible. Nobody in the Imperium's political discourse questioned the ethics of the Navigator transformation. Nobody asked whether the price was too high. Nobody examined the institutional structures that produced the transformation and assessed whether the structures were justified by the outcomes they generated. The acceptance was background, infrastructure, the moral equivalent of not thinking about where the water comes from, the specific form of moral unconsciousness that arises when a service is so essential and so reliable that the costs of providing it become invisible. Herbert saw this and made it visible. The Guild's story, in its entirety, is the story of what happens when a civilization makes a Faustian bargain and then forgets it made one. The bargain, human beings transformed into navigational instruments in exchange for the interstellar connectivity the civilization required. The forgetting, the progressive normalization of the transformation, the institutional routinization of the human cost, the development of a civilizational comfort with the trade that made the trade's moral dimension inaccessible to ordinary examination. The navigators paid the price, the civilization received the benefit. And the gap between the paying and the receiving, the gap in which the moral dimension of the transaction existed, was managed into invisibility by the institutional culture that the Guild maintained and that the Imperium accepted. The Guild's future, beyond the completed saga, beyond Chapterhouse's closing image of the no ship departing into the dark, is genuinely uncertain in a way that the Guild's institutional planning was not designed to manage. The Chapterhouse ecology would eventually produce spice. The sand trout were spreading, the desert conditions were developing, the ecological prerequisites for spice production were being established. Eventually, in decades or centuries, the spice would be available again, and the Guild's navigational prescience could be restored in the navigators who had survived the bridge period, or in new navigators trained from the restored supply. But the restored Guild would not be the old Guild. The institutional experience of the bridge period, the decline, the managed diminishment, the dependency on machines and on other institutions, the loss of the monopoly that had been the Guild's identity for 10,000 years, would have changed the institution in ways that the restoration of the spice supply could not reverse. The Guild that emerged from the bridge period would be a Guild that remembered what it had been, and that knew it could not be that again, that the monopoly was gone, that the machines were a permanent alternative, that the honoured matres had demonstrated that the Guild's navigational services were not the only way to move between worlds. The navigator culture, the community of perception, the artistry of transit calculation, the internal traditions that the navigator community had developed across millennia, would survive if any navigators survived the bridge period. But it would be a diminished culture, a remnant culture, the memory of what had been rather than the full expression of what was. The new Guild would have to find a way to be valuable in a universe where its historical value proposition was no longer unique, where the function it had monopolized was available from other sources, where the leverage that the monopoly had provided was gone. What would that Guild be? The saga does not answer, because the saga ends before the answer becomes available. The no-ship is gone. The Chapterhouse ecology is developing. The bridge period is underway. The Guild is diminishing. Somewhere in the probability space that the remaining navigators can still perceive with diminishing clarity, the paths forward are branching. Some lead to restoration, the spice returning, the navigator core rebuilding, the guild finding a new form for a new era. Some lead to dissolution, the reserves exhausted, the last navigator's tank going dark. The institution that made interstellar civilization possible becoming a historical memory rather than a living capability. The probability space does not show the navigators which path will be taken. The prescient faculty is degrading, the clarity is fading. The resolution that once made the navigational calculations an art form is blurring into the uncertainty that the end of the spice supply is producing. The navigators can see the paths branching, but they cannot see which branch is the one the future will follow. This uncertainty is, in a sense, the Golden Path's gift to the Guild that had existed inside the managed probability space of the God Emperor's reign. The Guild that had navigated a universe whose futures were being directed by a prescient consciousness more powerful than any navigator. That Guild had been operating in a managed landscape, perceiving paths that had been placed there by someone else's management. The uncertainty that the Guild now faced was the unmanaged landscape, the probability space as it existed without the God Emperor's direction. The futures that were open in a way they had not been open for 35 centuries. The openness was frightening for an institution that had spent its entire existence managing the risk of the unknown, that had been founded specifically to provide safe passage through the unpredictable, that had developed its entire institutional culture around the reduction of navigational uncertainty. The prospect of institutional uncertainty was uniquely threatening. But the openness was also, if the Guild's consciousness could be expanded beyond the navigational domain, a form of freedom. The futures that the diminishing prescient faculty showed were not being managed toward anyone's predetermined outcome. They were unfolding according to their own dynamics, shaped by the choices of the people inside them, rather than by the prescient management of someone outside. The Guild's future was not being decided for it. It was being decided by it, by the choices the Guild's surviving members made, by the institutional decisions that the Guild's leadership arrived at, by the response the Guild developed to the conditions it was facing. This was what freedom looked like, for an institution that had never been free in the way the Golden Path's vision of freedom described. The Guild had always been dependent on the spice, on the monopoly, on the political relationships that the monopoly sustained. The loss of the monopoly and the degradation of the spice supply were, in addition to being existential threats, the conditions under which the Guild might discover what it was when it was not defined by its dependency. The discovery was uncertain. The outcome was unknown. The probability space was blurring, but the paths were open. And somewhere, in a tank that was running low on spice gas, a navigator was looking at the open paths with the fading clarity of a prescient faculty that had spent millennia seeing the future, and that was now, for the first time, not certain what it saw. The uncertainty was new. The uncertainty was, in the vocabulary that the Guild's entire existence had been organized around managing, the most dangerous thing there was. The uncertainty was also, in the vocabulary that the Golden Path had been designed to produce, the most valuable. The Guild was facing its future, not the future it had been managed toward, not the future it had navigated toward. Its future. Unmanaged, unnavigated, unknown, the ships would fly. Whether the Guild would navigate them was the question the future was being asked to answer. The Highliners were the most massive mobile structures in the known universe, and their scale was itself a form of the Guild's institutional argument about what was possible when a function was performed at the level the Guild performed it. A Highliner was not a ship in the way that most vessels were ships. It was a container, an enclosed space large enough to carry smaller ships within it. mobile dock whose interior could accommodate the fleets and cargo vessels and diplomatic transports and commercial carriers that the Imperium's interstellar traffic generated. The scale was planetary rather than vehicular. A Highliner's cargo bay could contain entire naval flotillas, could house thousands of smaller craft simultaneously, could manage the logistics of loading and unloading that the Imperium's most active transit corridors required. The Highliners were the physical expression of the Guild's monopoly, not because they were difficult to build. The Imperium's industrial capability was sufficient to produce vessels of this scale, and the Ixians in particular had the manufacturing sophistication that Highliner construction required, because they were useless without a navigator. The Highliner's Holtzman drive could fold space, but folding space without a navigator's prescient guidance was the navigational equivalent of closing your eyes and stepping off a cliff. The probability of surviving was not zero, but it was low enough that no sane commercial or military operator would accept the risk. Every Highliner had a navigator, one consciousness sealed in its tank, perceiving the probability space through the concentrated spice gas, responsible for the safety of every person and every vessel and every piece of cargo inside the Highliner's enormous interior. The navigator's attention was not divided. The transit calculation was a single, sustained act of prescient perception that required the navigator's full concentration from the moment the foldspace drive was engaged until the moment the Highliner emerged at its destination. The calculation was not interrupted by the number of passengers or the weight of cargo or the complexity of the interior configuration. The navigator was navigating the Highliner, and everything inside the Highliner was carried along by the Highliner's transit. The experience of Highliner travel for the passengers, for the Landsraad nobles and the commercial operators and the military commanders and the billions of ordinary people whose lives required them to move between worlds, was the experience of entering the Highliner's cargo bay in one star system and exiting it in another. The transit itself was instantaneous from the passenger's perspective, not instantaneous in the physics sense, but so brief that the subjective experience was of one moment being in one place and the next moment being somewhere else, with no perceptible interval between. The passengers did not see the navigator. They did not interact with the navigator. They were not aware, in any direct experiential sense, of the prescient perception that was guiding the Highliner through full space. They knew that a navigator was doing it. The Guild's institutional reputation ensured that everyone who travelled by Highliner understood at the abstract level that a transformed human being, sealed in a spice gas tank, was responsible for their safe transit. But the knowing was abstract. The navigator was infrastructure. The experience of Highliner travel was not the experience of encountering the navigator, but the experience of using the service the navigator provided. This abstraction was the Guild's strategy expressed in physical form. The navigator was hidden, the function was visible, the service was reliable. The person who made the service possible was invisible, sealed behind the tank's walls, as hidden from the Highliner's passengers as the plumbing was hidden from the occupants of a building. Essential, invisible, taken for granted. The Guild also maintained a communications network, and this network was in some ways more consequential for the Imperium's daily functioning than the transportation service that received most of the attention. Interstellar communication in the Imperium was not instantaneous. The physics of the Dune universe did not provide for faster-than-light communication outside the mechanism of the Highliners themselves. A message that needed to travel between star systems travelled in the hold of a Highliner, carried physically from one world to another at the speed of full space transit. This meant that the speed of communication was the speed of the Guild's transportation schedule, A message sent from one world to another arrived when the next highliner arrived, which could be days or weeks depending on the transit frequency that the route's commercial traffic justified. The Guild managed this communication traffic as part of its transportation function, carrying diplomatic pouches and commercial correspondence and military dispatches alongside the passengers and cargo that constituted the bulk of its business. The management was routine, one more element of the comprehensive service that the Guild provided, one more dimension of the dependency that the Imperium had developed on the Guild's continued operation. But the management also gave the Guild access to information. Every message that travelled between worlds travelled through the Guild's system, and while the Guild maintained strict institutional policies about the confidentiality of the traffic it carried, the transportation company principle of not reading the mail, the opportunity for intelligence gathering that the communications monopoly provided, was not entirely wasted. The Guild knew which worlds were communicating with which other worlds, at what frequency, with what volume of traffic. The Guild did not need to read the messages to extract intelligence from the message traffic. The patterns of communication themselves told a story that the Guild's analysts could read. This intelligence capability was the Guild's least discussed institutional asset. The transportation monopoly was public knowledge. The communications function was acknowledged but unremarkable. The intelligence capability that the communications function produced was secret, not because the Guild concealed it through elaborate security measures, but because the capability was so obvious that nobody discussed it. In the same way that people did not discuss the fact that the postal service could, in principle, read their mail. The Guild used this intelligence conservatively, in keeping with the institutional strategy of minimal political engagement. The intelligence informed the Guild's commercial decisions, transit frequency adjustments, pricing modifications, the routing of highliners through the network in patterns that reflected the assessed demand rather than the Guild's political positioning. The Guild did not trade intelligence, did not sell its analysis to political actors, did not use its knowledge of communication patterns to gain political advantage in the way that a more aggressive institution might have. This restraint was part of the invisibility strategy. An institution that was known to use its communications monopoly for intelligence purposes would be an institution that other actors had reason to circumvent, developing alternative communication methods, encrypting their traffic, finding ways to communicate that did not depend on the Guild system. The Guild's restraint preserved the communications monopoly's value by ensuring that the monopoly's users did not develop the motivation to find alternatives. Edric, the navigator who participated in the Dune Messiah conspiracy, deserves extended individual attention because he is the navigator whose consciousness is most directly accessible through the saga's narrative, and because his participation in the conspiracy reveals something about what a navigator was capable of when the institutional constraints that normally governed navigator behavior were loosened. Edric was sealed in his tank like every other navigator. He communicated with the conspiracy's other members through the intermediary mechanisms that the tank's environment required, speaking through the interface that translated his voice from the spice gas medium of the tank into the atmospheric medium of ordinary rooms. He participated in the conspiracy's planning from the fixed location of his tank, unable to move freely, unable to attend meetings in the conventional sense, contributing his prescient concealment capability from the physical position he could not leave. His motivation for participating in the conspiracy was institutional rather than personal. The navigator's individual personality, to the extent that the navigator transformation left room for individual personality to operate, was subordinated to the institutional interest that the conspiracy served. Edric was not acting on personal grievance. He was acting on the Guild's institutional assessment that Paul Muad'Dib's prescient capability represented a threat to the Guild's position, and that the conspiracy's success would restore the conditions under which the Guild's monopoly was secure. This institutional motivation is the thing that distinguished Edric's participation from the participation of the conspiracy's other members. The Bene Tleilax participated for the Tleilaxu's institutional interests, the specific agenda that the Tleilaxu maintained behind their institutional secrecy. Princess Irulan participated for a combination of personal and political motives that the saga examines with considerable attention. Edric participated for the Guild. He was an institutional actor, performing an institutional function, deploying an institutional capability in service of institutional interests. The prescient concealment that Edric provided was not a navigator's normal function. Navigators navigated. They perceived the probability space for the purpose of guiding ships through fold space, and the navigational function was the thing the Guild trained them for and the thing the Guild deployed them to do. Using the prescient interference effect, the blurring of the probability space that a navigator's presence produced in the vicinity of other prescient consciousnesses as a deliberate political weapon was an application that the Guild's training protocols did not include and that the Guild's institutional culture had not previously sanctioned. Edric's participation in the conspiracy was therefore not just a political act, but an institutional innovation. The development of a new use for an existing capability, driven by the institutional pressure of circumstances that the existing capability's normal application could not address. The innovation was significant not because the interference effect was newly discovered. The Guild had known about it for centuries, but because the deliberate deployment of the effect as a political weapon represented a departure from the Guild's institutional norms that the conspiracy's pressure had produced. The conspiracy's failure, Paul survived. The political configuration that the conspiracy had been designed to displace was not displaced, and the Guild's participation was exposed, produced consequences for Edric and for the Guild that illustrated the risks of the institutional departure the conspiracy represented. The Guild had been seen taking sides. The Guild had been seen deploying its capability as a weapon. The institutional norm of invisibility and neutrality, which had protected the Guild's position for millennia, had been violated, and the violation was public knowledge. Edric himself was not punished in any dramatic sense. The conspiracy's failure did not produce the kind of retribution that a more openly political act might have provoked. But the institutional damage was real, and Edric's name became, within the Guild's institutional culture, a cautionary reference. The navigator whose participation in a failed conspiracy had demonstrated what happened when the Guild's institutional norms were violated, and the violation did not produce the institutional benefit that had justified it. The relationship between the Guild and the Bene Gesserit was the longest-running institutional relationship in the Imperium, and the one that most revealingly demonstrated both institutions' approaches to power and position. The Bene Gesserit and the Guild were, in structural terms, mirror images. Both were institutions organized around a biological capability that the institution's training developed and maintained. Both depended on the spice for the biological augmentation that their respective capabilities required. Both occupied positions of institutional power that derived not from political authority or military force, but from the provision of capabilities that no other institution could replicate. The differences were in the approach to the power that the capabilities provided. The Bene Gesserit's approach was interventionist. The sisterhood actively shaped the political landscape, managed bloodlines. positioned its members in relationships of influence, pursued the long-term objectives of the breeding program with a sustained directedness that constituted the most ambitious institutional project in human history. The Guild's approach was passive. The Guild maintained its position by serving everyone, avoided political entanglement, managed the transportation monopoly with the institutional commitment to invisibility that decades of strategic development had refined. The two approaches produced two very different institutional cultures. The Bene Gesserit culture was one of calculated engagement. Every member was an actor. Every relationship was an opportunity. Every situation was assessed for its potential contribution to the Sisterhood's institutional objectives. The Guild culture was one of calculated detachment. Every political development was assessed for its potential threat to the spice supply and the transportation monopoly. And the assessment's conclusion was almost always the same: maintain the current position, avoid engagement, serve everyone. The relationship between the two institutions was cooperative on the surface and cautious underneath. Both needed the spice. Both depended on the political stability that the Imperium's tripod power structure maintained. Both had institutional interests that were served by the continuation of the existing order. These shared interests produced a cooperation that was reliable without being warm. The two institutions worked together when their interests aligned, communicated through established channels, maintained the mutual respect that two powerful institutions with overlapping dependencies naturally developed. The caution was deeper. The Bene Gesserit understood through millennia of institutional analysis that the Guild's passivity was a strategic choice rather than a constitutional incapacity, that the Guild could, if circumstances required, deploy its capabilities in active political intervention, as the Edric episode demonstrated. The Guild understood, through its own millennia of institutional observation, that the Bene Gesserit's cooperation was always calibrated to the Sisterhood's institutional interests, and that those interests might, in circumstances the Guild could not fully predict, diverge from the Guild's own in ways that the cooperation's surface reliability might conceal. The two institutions watched each other with the sustained attention that long-term institutional competitors brought to the observation of their rivals, even when the rivalry was indirect and the competition was more structural than operational. The Bene Gesserit watched for signs that the Guild's passivity might shift, that the Guild might develop political ambitions that would complicate the Sisterhood's management of the political landscape. The Guild watched for signs that the Bene Gesserit's interventionism might produce changes in the political order that would threaten the spice supply or the transportation monopoly. This mutual observation produced a relationship that was stable without being trusting. The most common form of institutional relationship in the Imperium's political landscape, where trust was a luxury that the political dynamics did not often support. The stability was grounded in the mutual dependency on the spice and the mutual interest in the existing order's continuation. The lack of trust was grounded in the mutual understanding that each institution would, if circumstances required, act in its own institutional interest, regardless of the other institution's convenience. The Tleilaxu relationship with the Guild was simpler and darker. The Bene Tleilax were the Imperium's biological engineers, the culture that had developed the Gola technology, the face dancers, and the various other biological capabilities that constituted their institutional product line. The Tleilaxu and the Guild had a commercial relationship that was old and straightforward. The Tleilaxu provided biological products and services that the Guild required for the maintenance of its operations, and the Guild provided transportation services that the Tleilaxu required for the distribution of their products across the Imperium's market. The darkness was in the Tleilaxu's ambitions. The Bene Tleilax had been working across the millennia of the Imperium's history on biological engineering projects whose scope exceeded what the Tleilaxu's commercial product line suggested. The Gola technology was not simply a service offered to customers, it was a research program whose ultimate objectives the Tleilaxu kept hidden behind their institutional secrecy. The face dancers were not simply intelligence tools, they were the visible expression of a biological engineering capability that the Tleilaxu were developing toward objectives that the other institutions of the Imperium did not fully understand. The Guild's relationship with the Tleilaxu was, therefore, a relationship with an institution whose full capabilities and objectives were not known. The Guild managed this uncertainty with the institutional pragmatism that characterized all of the Guild's relationships, maintain the commercial connection, monitor the Tleilaxu's activities to the extent the Guild's intelligence capability permitted, and manage the risk of the unknown by maintaining sufficient institutional independence that a Tleilaxu surprise would not produce institutional catastrophe. The Tleilaxu's role in the Dune Messiah conspiracy complicated this relationship. The Tleilaxu had been the conspiracy's biological engineers, providing the Duncan Idaho Gola that was the conspiracy's most sophisticated weapon, providing the face dancer Cytail, who was the conspiracy's operational agent. The Guild had been the conspiracy's prescient shield. The collaboration had placed the two institutions in a relationship of shared complicity that exceeded the commercial norm, and that produced, in its aftermath, a mutual awareness that the relationship could be more than commercial if circumstances required. This awareness was managed on both sides with the caution that institutional self-interest demanded. The Guild did not trust the Tleilaxu any more after the conspiracy than before. If anything, the collaboration had confirmed the Guild's institutional assessment that the Tleilaxu were capable of more than their public profile suggested, and that the capability was directed toward objectives that the Guild's interests might not be served by. The Tleilaxu did not trust the Guild more after the conspiracy either. The conspiracy's failure had demonstrated that the Guild's capabilities, while valuable, were not sufficient to guarantee the success of the ventures the Guild participated in. The final accounting of what the Spacing Guild was and what it meant for the civilization it served requires holding several things simultaneously. Because the Guild was several things simultaneously, and the holding is the only honest way to assess it. The Guild was essential. This is the baseline fact that every other assessment has to accommodate. The Imperium could not have existed without the Guild. Interstellar civilization required interstellar transportation, and the Guild was, for 10,000 years, the only institution that could provide it reliably. This essentiality was real, was earned, was maintained through the sustained effort of generations of navigators and administrators who kept the highliners flying and the ships arriving and the interstellar network functioning. The Guild was conservative. The essentiality produced conservatism as surely as the spice produced blue eyes. The institutional logic of protecting a monopoly this valuable led inevitably to the avoidance of any risk that might disrupt it. The conservatism served the Guild well across the millennia of the Imperium's stable period, maintaining the position through the ordinary political fluctuations that the tripod power structure generated. The conservatism served the Guild badly when the disruptions exceeded what the ordinary political fluctuations had produced, when Paul threatened the spice, when the God Emperor managed it, when the honoured matres destroyed it. The Guild was dependent. The essentiality that gave the Guild its power was also the chain that bound it to the spice supply. Every other institutional quality, the political strategy, the internal culture, the commercial relationships, the intelligence capability, was downstream of the dependency on the spice. The Guild could not act freely because the Guild could not risk the spice supply. The Guild could not innovate because the Guild could not risk the stability that innovation might disrupt. The Guild could not evolve because the Guild could not afford the uncertainty that evolution required. The Guild was tragic. Not in the dramatic sense. The Guild's story does not contain the climactic reversals and the personal catastrophes that tragedy in the literary sense requires. In the structural sense, the Guild was an institution whose most valuable quality was also its most constraining limitation, whose success was also its prison, whose essentiality to the civilization it served was the same thing as its inability to be anything other than what the essentiality required. The Navigators were the most complete expression of this tragedy, human beings who had given up their humanity for a function, consciousnesses that had traded the full range of human experience for the ability to perceive one dimension of reality with unprecedented clarity. People who had become instruments, valued for what they could do rather than for what they were, maintained in their tanks for the duration of their useful lives, and replaced when the useful life ended. They were not slaves. The transformation was voluntary. The Guild's treatment of its navigators was not cruel. The tanks were maintained. The spice supply was managed. The institutional support was provided. But the relationship between the navigators and the Guild was not the relationship between free individuals and the institution they chose to serve. It was the relationship between a function and the institution that the function served. The navigator was the function, and the institution valued the function, and the person inside the function was as invisible as the navigator inside the tank. Herbert saw this and made it visible in the way that the best science fiction makes visible the things that ordinary fiction leaves in the background. The Guild is the infrastructure of the Dune universe, the system that makes everything else possible, the service that everyone depends on and nobody examines, the institution that is too essential to question and too powerful to challenge and too invisible to criticize. The navigator in the tank is every essential worker whose humanity is rendered invisible by the essentiality of their function. The Guild's monopoly is every dependency that a civilization develops on a capability it cannot replicate and therefore cannot question. The spice in the tank is every resource that a critical function depends on and that the function's users take for granted until the resource is gone. The Spacing Guild was the most powerful institution in the known universe. The Spacing Guild was also the most trapped. The power and the trap were the same thing, and the same thing was the spice, and the spice was the worm, and the worm was the desert, and the desert was Arrakis, and Arrakis was the center of everything, because the center of everything was the biology of a creature that did not know it was the center of anything. The ships flew because the navigators perceived the paths. The navigators perceived the paths because the spice opened the perception. The spice existed because the worms produced it. The worms produced it because the desert sustained them. The desert sustained them because the sand trout sealed the moisture. And the sand trout sealed the moisture because that was what sand trout did. Without intention, without awareness, without any knowledge of the civilization that had been built on the foundation of their biological function. The Guild understood every link in this chain. The Guild had spent millennia managing the chain's vulnerabilities. The Guild had organized its entire institutional existence around the chain's maintenance. And the chain broke anyway. Not because the Guild failed to manage it. The Guild's management was exemplary within the limits of what management could achieve, because the chain's vulnerability was structural rather than managerial. The vulnerability was that the chain existed, that the civilization's most critical function depended on a single source that could be disrupted, and that no amount of institutional management could eliminate the vulnerability that the single source dependency created. The civilization learned this lesson, learned it through the burning of Arrakis, through the famine times, through the Guild's managed decline, and the Ixian machine's rise, and the slow, painful development of alternatives that should have been developed millennia earlier, but that the Guild's monopoly had made unnecessary. The lesson was the Golden Path's lesson, applied to the institutional dimension. Dependency is vulnerability, monopoly is fragility. The thing that works so well that no one develops an alternative is the thing whose failure, when it comes, is catastrophic because no alternative exists. The Guild was the infrastructure. The infrastructure was the dependency. The dependency was the vulnerability. And the vulnerability, when it was finally exploited, brought down the most powerful institution in the history of human civilization. The Highliners still fly. Someone is still navigating them, a navigator on diminishing spice, a machine from Ix, some capability developed in the dark of the scattering that the known universe has not yet catalogued. The ships still fold space. The passengers still board at one star and disembark at another, trusting the process they do not see, depending on the capability they do not understand, arriving safely at destinations they could not reach without the service they take for granted. The Guild built this. For 10,000 years, the Guild built this, and maintained it, and managed the dependencies it created, and served the civilization that depended on it. What the Guild could not do was make the civilization recognize the cost of the depending, and the failure to recognize the cost was the one failure that all the Guild's competence could not prevent. The navigator is in the tank. The spice gas is running low. The probability space is blurring. And somewhere beyond the blur, the future is waiting to be seen by eyes that may or may not be there to see it. The training of a Guild Navigator was a process that the Guild's institutional secrecy kept more thoroughly hidden than almost any other element of the institution's operations, and what can be reconstructed from the fragments available in the saga's narrative suggests a program of sustained biological and psychological development that was as demanding as anything the Imperium's other. Institutions produced. The candidates were selected young. The Guild's recruitment assessed genetic potential, the traits that the accumulated institutional knowledge had identified as predictive of navigational capability, and the selection was rigorous in the way that selection for any rare and consequential capability had to be. Most human beings could not become navigators. The genetic foundation that the navigational prescience required was present in a small fraction of the population, and even among those who possessed it, only a further fraction had the foundation at levels sufficient for the development program to work with. The early stages of training were conducted without the spice immersion that the later stages required. The candidates learned the theoretical framework of navigation, the physics of the Holtzman drive, the mathematics of fold space geometry, the navigational models that the Guild had developed across millennia of accumulated experience. They learnt these things in the conventional way, through instruction and study and the acquisition of knowledge that could be transmitted through ordinary educational methods. The spice exposure began gradually, not the immersion, not the sealed tank, not the concentrated gas that the fully developed navigators inhabited, dietary supplementation, at levels above the ordinary Imperium consumption, but far below the navigator concentrations. The supplementation began the biological changes that the navigational capability required, the initial expansion of the perceptual field, the first glimpse of the probability space that the full development would eventually make continuously available. The candidates who responded to the initial supplementation, whose bodies adapted to the spice in ways that the Guild's medical monitoring identified as consistent with the development of navigational capability, progressed to higher levels of exposure. The increases were carefully calibrated, each step assessed against the candidate's biological response, the progression proceeding only when the medical monitoring confirmed that the candidate's body was adapting rather than deteriorating. Not all candidates succeeded. The attrition in the training program was substantial. Some candidates' bodies could not adapt to the increasing spice levels. Some candidates' perceptual development did not progress in the ways the navigational function required. Some candidates' psychological architecture could not accommodate the expanding perception of the probability space. The failures were managed with the institutional competence the Guild brought to all of its operations. Candidates who could not progress were withdrawn from the program, their spice exposure reduced to manageable levels, their future redirected toward the Guild's administrative and support functions rather than the navigational role they could not fill. The transition from dietary supplementation to immersion was the program's most consequential stage. The candidate entered the tank, the sealed environment that would, if the development proceeded as the program intended, become their permanent home. The spice gas surrounded them. The concentration was higher than anything the dietary supplementation had produced, and the biological response to the immersion was dramatic. The accelerated physical transformation, the deepening of the perceptual expansion, the progression from glimpses of the probability space to sustained perception of it. The first navigational calculation was performed under supervision, an experienced navigator monitoring the candidate's perception through whatever form of inter-navigator communication the tank environment supported, providing guidance and correction as the candidate attempted the calculation that the probability space perception made possible. The calculation was not simple, even with the perceptual access that the immersion provided. The probability space was vast and complex, and the navigational paths through it were not obvious. They had to be identified through the sustained attention and the trained judgment that the Guild's educational program was designed to develop. Successful first calculations were followed by progressive assignments of increasing complexity, longer transits, more complex fold space geometries, higher consequence routes that required more precise calculation. The navigator's capability, developed through practice, refined through the accumulated experience of navigational decisions whose outcomes provided feedback that no theoretical instruction could substitute for. The fully developed navigator, the product of years of selection, training, supplementation, immersion, and progressive navigational practice, was an organism whose capabilities were as far from the original candidates as any biological development program had ever produced. The transformation was complete. The capability was demonstrated. The navigator was ready for the assignments that the Guild's operational needs required, and the navigator was, from that point forward, inside the tank. Not temporarily, not for the duration of a shift or a mission or a deployment. Permanently, the tank was the navigator's home, and the navigator would not leave it for the remainder of their life, because the body's adaptation to the tank's spice gas environment was irreversible, and the tank's environment was the only environment that could sustain the adapted body. This permanence, the absolute, irreversible, lifelong commitment to the tank, was the thing about the navigator training that the Guild's institutional culture managed with the most deliberate care. The candidates knew, before they entered the immersion stage, what they were committing to. The institutional culture did not conceal the permanence, or minimize it, or dress it up in the vocabulary of honor and sacrifice that other institutions use to make their members' commitments feel more comfortable. The Guild was direct. This is what the training leads to. This is what the navigation requires. This is the life you will live if you proceed. The choosing was, in the Guild's institutional assessment, the most important moment in the training program. Not because the choosing selected for courage, though it did, in its way. Because the choosing was the moment at which the candidate ceased to be a candidate and became, in the institutional vocabulary, a committed navigator. The commitment was not ceremonial, it was biological. The body that entered the immersion stage would be permanently changed, and the permanent change would make the commitment irrevocable in the most literal possible way. Fold space transit itself, the physical event of a highliner moving from one point in the known universe to another, was described by those who studied it in terms that combined physics and philosophy in ways that the Imperium's scientific establishment found uncomfortable. The Holtzman drive was the technology. The physics of the drive involved the manipulation of the spatial dimensions that ordinary physics described, the folding of the distance between 2 points so that the distance became zero and the transit became, in the mathematical sense, instantaneous. The drive had been developed in the pre-Jihad era, when the thinking machine's computational capability had provided the navigational calculations that safe transit required. The post-Jihad navigation, the biological navigation that the Guild Navigators provided, used the same drive technology but replaced the computational calculation with a prescient perception. The navigator did not calculate the transit in the mathematical sense. The navigator perceived the transit, saw the probability space in which the folding occurred, identified the configuration of the folding that would produce the desired outcome, and guided the drive's operation toward that configuration through the sustained act of prescient attention that the navigational function required. What the navigator perceived during the transit was not physical space in any ordinary sense. The probability space that the prescient faculty accessed was not a place, not a location that the navigator's perception was transported to, not an environment that the navigator moved through. It was a dimension, a perceptual dimension that the spice-augmented consciousness could access, in which the possible configurations of fold space transit existed as perceivable structures that the navigator could evaluate and choose among. The structures were not visual. The accounts of navigator perception that survive in the saga's fragments describe the probability space perception in terms that resist translation into the sensory vocabulary of ordinary experience. The navigators did not see the paths through fold space. They perceived them through a sense that the spice had opened, a perceptual modality that had no analogue in the ordinary human sensory repertoire, a way of knowing that was as direct as sight, but that operated in a dimension that sight could not access. The transit was dangerous. This bears repeating, because the Guild's reliability could create the impression that fold space transit was safe in the way that routine services are safe, that the danger had been eliminated by the Guild's institutional competence. The danger had not been eliminated. It had been managed. Every transit was an encounter with the specific physics of fold space, and the physics included the possibility of catastrophic failure, the misconfiguration of the folding, the misidentification of the safe path, the emergence at a location that the intended destination did not correspond to, or the non-emergence that complete navigational failure produced. The navigators managed this danger. The prescient perception gave them access to the probability space in which the safe paths were identifiable, and the training gave them the judgment to identify which paths were safe and to guide the drive toward them. The management was effective. The failure rate was low enough that highliner travel was the safest form of long-distance transportation in the Imperium by a substantial margin. But the management was not the elimination of risk. It was the reduction of risk to levels that the civilization's transportation needs made acceptable. Every transit for the navigator was an encounter with the full consequence of what they were doing. The prescient perception showed the navigator not only the safe paths, but the unsafe ones, the configurations of the folding that would produce disaster, the probability space structures that corresponded to catastrophic failure, the paths that would destroy the highliner and everything inside it. The navigator saw these paths every time, because the probability space contained them every time, and the act of navigating was the act of choosing the safe path in full awareness of the unsafe alternatives. This continuous encounter with the possibility of catastrophe was part of what made the navigator's psychological experience qualitatively different from ordinary consciousness. The navigator lived in perpetual awareness of the specific, detailed probability space visible forms that catastrophic failure could take, and the awareness was not abstract, it was perceptual, as immediate and as vivid as the perception of any other feature of the probability space landscape. The navigator saw disaster the way ordinary people saw the ground below, a high ledge, present, visible, a reminder of what could happen if the attention lapsed or the judgment failed. The Guild's institutional culture managed this psychological burden through the navigator community, through the shared understanding of what the navigational perception was like, through the mutual acknowledgement of the burden that the continuous disaster awareness imposed, through the institutional support that the community provided for navigators whose psychological architecture was strained by the sustained weight of the perception. The strain was real. Some navigators developed what the Guild's medical literature described as navigational fatigue, the progressive degradation of the psychological capability to sustain the probability space perception at the levels the navigational function required. The fatigue was managed through rotation schedules, through the assignment of less demanding routes to navigators showing signs of strain, through the institutional recognition that the navigational function's psychological demands were not sustainable at maximum intensity indefinitely. The fatigued navigator was not simply a tired person who needed rest. The fatigue was perceptual. The degradation of the probability space perception's clarity. The blurring of the paths that the perception was supposed to resolve, the loss of the fine discrimination between safe and unsafe configurations that the navigational function depended on. A fatigued navigator was a navigator whose navigational capability was compromised, and the compromise was dangerous in the way that any degradation of a safety-critical capability was dangerous. Not immediately catastrophic, but representing an elevated risk that the institutional quality management systems were designed to detect and manage. The management of navigational fatigue was one of the Guild's most important operational functions, more important in some assessments than the initial training program, because the training produced the capability and the fatigue management sustained it. The Guild invested substantial institutional resources in the monitoring and support of its active navigators, maintaining the continuous assessment of navigational capability that the safety of the highliner traffic required. The pre-Paul era, the millennia of the Imperium's history between the Guild's founding and the Atreides' transfer to Arrakis, was the period in which the Guild's institutional position was most secure and most effectively managed. And understanding the security of this period is essential for understanding how dramatically the Paul era and its aftermath disrupted it. The Guild's relationship with the Carino emperors across the pre-Paul millennia was the model of the institutional relationship that the Guild's strategy was designed to produce. The emperors needed the Guild. The Guild served the emperors. The service was reliable, the relationship was stable, and the stability was maintained by the mutual understanding that both parties benefited from the continuation of the existing arrangement. The emperors used the Guild to project imperial authority across the Imperium, the Sardaukar deployments, the administrative communications, the commercial traffic that constituted the economic foundation of the imperial treasury, all depended on the Guild's highliners. The Guild used the imperial relationship to maintain the political conditions under which the spice supply was reliable, the Emperor's administration of the Chom framework, the Emperor's management of the Arrakis fief assignment, the Emperor's enforcement of the political stability that the Guild's conservatism required. The relationship was not equal. The Emperor had political authority that the Guild did not possess. The Guild had transportation capability that the Emperor could not replicate. The inequality was managed through the tripod structure. The Landsraad's presence as the third leg preventing either the Emperor or the Guild from exploiting the other's dependency without the third leg's response. The stability of this arrangement across 10,000 years was the Guild's greatest institutional achievement and the thing that made the disruption of the Paul era feel, inside the Guild's institutional culture, not simply like a political crisis, but like the end of a world. The world that the Guild had built, the stable, predictable, managed world of reliable transportation and reliable spice supply and reliable political relationships was ending, and the Guild's institutional capability, which had been developed for the world that was ending, was not well suited for the world that was replacing it. The pre-Paul Guild had been excellent at what the pre-Paul world required. The Guild that survived the Paul era, the Jihad years, the God Emperor's management, the famine times, and the honoured matrices' devastation needed to be excellent at something different. And the transformation from what the Guild had been to what the Guild needed to become was the institutional challenge that the saga's later periods presented, without any assurance that the transformation would succeed. The Spacing Guild, the institution that made the Imperium possible, the monopoly that was also a prison, the dependency that was also a vulnerability, the navigators who were instruments as well as people, the highliners that carried everything and whose carriers were invisible, the most essential institution in 10,000 years of human civilization, confronting the discovery that essentiality was not permanence, that monopoly was not immunity, that the thing that made you indispensable could also be the thing that made you irreplaceable, and that being irreplaceable was, in a universe that the Golden Path had made free, no longer a guarantee that you would not have to be replaced. The Guild endures. In whatever form the post-Chapter House future produces, in whatever configuration the restored spice and the competing machines and the returning scattered populations create, the Guild endures. Not as what it was, that Guild is gone, as surely as the pre-Paul Imperium is gone, as surely as the Fremen of Sietch Tabr are gone, as what it becomes, whatever that turns out to be. The probability space is still there, the paths through fold space still exist, the ships still need to be navigated by navigator or by machine through the folding that carries the human species between the stars. The Guild built the capability to navigate those paths. Whether the Guild will be the institution that continues to navigate them is the question the future is answering. The answer is being written in spice gas and machine code and the uncharted trajectories of ships that have gone beyond the maps. The answer is being written. The Guild is waiting to read it.